All right, sounds good.
So yeah, we're now live with that. And if you've had a chance to look at any of the other recordings I've done, I start each of them with a mindfulness exercise. And is that something you'd be willing to join me in right
Yeah,
now?
sure. Do it.
So the concept behind these different practices that I do is just to kind of like become more present in right now with myself and how I'm feeling and just clearing anything I might be carrying around in my mind and just offering that to anyone who's joining me in these calls or listening to them later. And each one I've done has been a little different. Have you done any mindfulness practices yourself?
Yeah, I've done a ton.
Oh, awesome.
Um, yeah,
Are there
been mostly just like mindfulness meditation. I've tried to do it at least like 2 or 3 times a week. Um,
awesome?
yeah.
Is there any certain modality that you appreciate?
Uh, no, it's mostly just deep breathing. And then working on clearing my mind essentially.
Awesome.
But I don't know the modalities or
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
the reason I ask is like a lot of them focus on breath, but there's some that focus on body, or there's some that focus on like repeating certain things in your mind or imagery. The, I was just curious if there was one that you found works best for you. For me, I typically just do um, an awareness of my breath,
Okay. Yeah.
and I'll go ahead and do kind of what I've done in most of my sessions working with kids, because
Okay.
it's a straightforward just breathing and keep all awareness on your breath, and your mind will start to wander. And I'm going to be offering just gentle reminders to just come back to 100% awareness on your breath. I will say we'll start with a deep breath, and it's going to be audible when you take that breath in and out, kind of like a dog when they take that deep breath right as they lay down. You hear them sigh, but they
Yeah.
sigh in and out, where it's like, just to offer a chance for the body to relax. And now, as we're breathing, you don't have to change your breath at all. Just notice it and be aware. And if it helps, each time you breathe in, say to yourself, I'm breathing in. And as you relax and breathe out, notice that you're breathing out. And as your mind starts to wander, come back to noticing your breath. All of your attention on your breathing. And if you get distracted, just come back to your breathing. When I do these practices on my own, I like to do at least 2 to 5 minutes would be like my average. But a lot of times, depending on what I'm doing, I might do it for like 10 minutes, which I know is really hard for some people to spend that time sitting. That I'm curious of when were you introduced to mindfulness?
Actually, about like 10 years ago, probably.
Awesome.
Um,
Same for me.
yeah, just I think it was like a pretty stressful part of my life, and so part of that was learning to control my thoughts and being able to. And one way of doing that is getting better at mindfulness.
Yeah,
Um,
so you were almost seeking it out as like you were
yeah,
looking for tools to help manage stress.
partially. I mean, I was going through therapy at the time as well.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, I had like a panic disorder that was diagnosed way back when, and so
All right.
part of the way that that's treated is being able to, control your thoughts and stop yourself from getting
Yeah,
into these thought loops. And so definitely, having more control over your own mind, I think has definitely just really helped me with some of those issues. So
I think it's an incredibly powerful. I'll call it a tool.
yeah,
Um, but I have a pretty good foundation in or belief in cognitive behavioral therapy as the concept, like the most basic way to describe it is your thoughts control your behaviors.
yeah,
Your thoughts control your perception and your life and things like that. And I've shared with so many people. I try and share mindfulness with anyone who seems open or could benefit from it, which I think is everyone.
yeah,
Um, and I've said to so many kids that I've worked with, because I guess we haven't talked in maybe almost 10 years,
yeah,
that
yeah. I have no
I've,
idea what you do.
yeah, I've been working with kids in elementary schools who've experienced some type of trauma or significant events in their life and helping them just develop tools and skills to navigate stress in their life.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I've found it to be really rewarding.
How
And
long have you
I've
been?
I've learned a lot from it.
How long have you been doing that?
I was in the high school for 1 year, and then I was in elementary schools for the last 2 years.
Okay,
Um, and I got my master's in clinical mental health counseling.
okay,
And
gotcha. You seem like a therapist. Yeah,
that
yeah,
that's what I'm educated in.
yeah,
Most educated formally in anyway.
yeah,
I'd say I'm pretty educated in bass fishing too, but
yeah,
that's informal.
yeah,
um, but I've shared with so many of these kids, I'm like, the most powerful thing I know in existence that I've come across yet is mindfulness.
yeah,
Because every session that I do, I start with what we just practiced right there. Was just a simple mindful breathing exercise where it's just like, just notice you, notice your body, notice your breath. And as your mind goes to other things, just bring it right back. You have that control of just bringing your attention to your breathing. And I've found through my exploration and conversing with different people that mindfulness, it can give you total freedom of anything that might latch on to your perception.
yeah,
It gives you control to say yes or no. I'm gonna react to this, or I'm gonna feel this way or that way. You get to choose. It's like to put you in the like control room
yeah.
instead of down on the floor where everything is crazy. It's like, nope, I get to be up above it and observe it and choose.
Yeah, and I think just breaking out of the, this automaton, like just going through the paces, I think for me, that's really what mindfulness has helped with, where it's just, breaking down and saying, like, okay, I'm not going to just keep going through this cycle. I need to stop and think about what,
Yeah.
you know, I'm
There's
a human being. Yeah.
yeah, and you're gonna face stress. Like that's
Yeah.
something that I haven't figured out why it seems to be a part of like the necessity of life.
Yeah.
Everything that is alive and being is experiencing stress. If you have too much of it, the things break down and don't function, which I think pretty much everyone I've talked to, including myself, has come across moments in their life that they felt like that, where the stress was breaking stuff down.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and like we didn't evolve for this kind of stress. I mean, our stress
yeah,
back in the day was like, a cougar's about to eat us, and
yeah,
then and then the cougar's gone, and it's like, okay, like I can relax now. Now it's just like there's
yep.
constantly a
Back
cougar
to
that's
eating. I'm fine. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
you keep looking around, but you're not stressed for the cougar. You're just aware.
yeah. Now
But
it's just these low levels of stress all the time.
yeah,
Um,
and it's
and
always active. And the
yeah,
our brain doesn't have like a low level stress response. It
yeah,
either turns on the safety system or it doesn't. And
yeah,
that's
exactly.
when it's turned on, you're you change the chemicals that your brain is pumping out. You change the filters of your perception, and the your metabolism is going to change. Your immune system is going to change. Like your whole body goes into survival mode.
Yeah.
which is super, super helpful and convenient that we have that. Without that, we would all probably die. But if you keep it turned on, you also probably are going to
Yeah, it's like
die. Just a slow, painful death.
yeah. This guy, I think he retired now, but there's a doctor at or a researcher at Stanford who his name's Robert Sapolsky. Um, and he wrote a book called it's like why zebras don't get ulcers, and it's all about how like zebras are stressed about getting eaten by lions, but like they're not getting ulcers because they're having existential dread or anything. It's like
Right.
you know, whereas
There's no like mental fear that
yeah,
stays in there.
yeah, exactly. The rest of the time they're just living their fullest, being a zebra.
Yeah, they're just
Yeah,
taking in all of the inputs of life, just
yeah,
experiencing. And then when they have an input that says danger, they respond to that. And then once it's gone, they go back to no danger.
yeah,
Um, in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a perspective of like it's a triangle that just cycles, and it cycles that your thoughts lead to your behaviors lead to your actions, and your actions lead to your thoughts, and it just cycles through that. And I've used that. I was actually talking about it at work the other day, but I've used it with a lot of kids to tell them like, this is what, and I think it's more complex than that, but that's a really simple, like basic way
yeah,
that does cover what I think is kind of happening for us in our functioning. And let's say you have an event where someone yelled at you, and I'll use an example from my school. It's like the teacher says like, quit talking. And in that kid's head, it's like, oh, I was doing something wrong. I'm not good. And then their feeling is, oh, I don't feel very good. I'm sad and I'm angry. Or I feel scared because they yelled at me. And then their action is going to be a stress response.
yeah,
They're either going to fight someone or they're going to run away from the stimuli. It's like the fight or flight. Or you
yeah.
have the freeze, but that
That doesn't happen much. Yeah,
it doesn't happen as often. That like you're either gonna now be aggressive towards the teacher and talk back, or you're gonna just like put your head down on your desk or like throw your papers on the floor. Like you're seeing these kids have these reactions, and then let's say they talk back to the teacher and they're like, "Whatever, I'm just talking to my friends." And now they're gonna think, "Oh man, I just talked back to the teacher. I'm gonna get in trouble. That was a bad idea. That was disrespectful." And now they're feeling scared, guilty, and shame. And then they're
yeah,
gonna act again out of stress, and that cycle just continues. And you can't change your actions because your actions are based on how you're feeling.
yeah,
So you have to change how you're feeling first. But how you're feeling is based on your perception of whatever you're experiencing. So that goes back to your thoughts about what you're doing. And that's where I've said like mindfulness is this incredibly powerful thing, because if you can take your mind and you find where like your subconscious thoughts are meeting into the conscious,
yeah,
is fairly easy to do as long as you just sit and notice it. But that it takes practice to be able to sit and notice
yeah.
that without being bombarded with all these like, well, I need to be doing
Exactly.
this. I don't have time to sit down and like meditate. This isn't doing any good for me. Like you need to slow down, focus on your breath, and then you can choose your thoughts. And something that I've come across that I've liked to share with anyone again who's willing to listen is I've found that there's some things that I call magic thoughts. And that's a term that I use because again I was teaching this to elementary school kids, but
Yeah,
it works fine because these thoughts automatically override to give you positive feelings. And the simplest one is I am lovable, where I think everyone is lovable all of the time. Your actions might not be, but you as a person are.
yeah,
So if you have that thought, I am lovable, now you're going to be feeling good in some way. You're going to have positive emotions and feelings. And if you have positive emotions and feelings, it's really easy to act in a positive way. And then now you're acting in a positive way, and it's easier to think, like, wow, I am lovable. Look what I just did. And now it'll stay in that positive loop cycle. And whenever you slip out of that and you notice that like things don't like you don't feel good and you have negative emotions, or you faced an event that was like, wow, I didn't act in a way that I liked there. You just plug in that. one of those magic thoughts of like, no, I'm lovable, and it just resets the cycle. And now,
Yeah.
and it's a like a almost like hijacking into the side of mindfulness, like a shortcut.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about like practicing, like I really do think that as far as mindfulness is concerned, it's kind of a different kind of practice too, where
Mm-hmm.
you really can't force it.
Yeah.
You can't say like I'm not going to think about anything because thinking about not thinking is like you're still
Yep.
thinking about it, and
Yep.
it's almost gets harder the more you try. So something very like zen about that, where you have to try without trying, essentially. To
Doing, not doing.
yeah, exactly.
Way woo way.
Yeah,
Um, that's something I've definitely noticed in my own life a lot of times when I start to get stressed. And I don't know how I end up slipping out of it. I think it's when I like finally relax that I notice that I've been doing it. But I've had a handful of times where I notice that I'm thinking about being mindful, but I'm not actually being mindful. I'm just thinking about it. Where
yeah.
it's
Like I'm being so mindful right now. Like yeah,
um,
yeah,
and not even that, but like thinking to myself, like, okay, I'm noticing my breath, or like, okay, I'm walking, but my head is still spinning on all these things that I'm like telling myself I have to get done.
yeah,
And these responsibilities of adulthood and of like professional relationships or whatever it might be is like, no, I'm not actually being mindful. I'm just thinking about being mindful.
yeah.
Um,
I think that's kind of a side effect of the culture in a way. Just you know,
mhm.
we're kind of taught that we need to always be productive. If you're not being productive, then you're getting behind. If you're not moving forward, you're moving back. And mindfulness is
Yeah,
essentially not moving forward. You're taking time outside of that rat race.
yeah.
Um, so I
Um,
think it's probably more difficult for people growing up in a society like the West.
I would
For
agree.
you know, if you grew up on a farm in Southeast Asia, sure you have. I mean, probably not the best life, but you're not. I don't think you have the same stress to constantly be moving ahead. You're probably stressed about other things, but um,
If you're not stressed in our culture, people seem to freak out, get extra stressed, and tell you why you need to be stressed.
yeah,
It's like, what are you doing? You can't just sit here right now. You have to keep getting work done. Like, why
yeah,
are you being, what are you doing? Are you being lazy? Or are you being unproductive? And it's like, what do you mean you don't know what you're doing tomorrow for work? And it's like, why are you bombarding me with your stress right now? I was just
yeah.
sitting here.
It's like the other people in your field are working and they know exactly what they're doing. So like, if you don't know that, then you're like behind them, and so it's just constantly, yeah, this like competition where it's like who can be the most stressed out, essentially. Yeah,
It does seem that way. Like,
yeah,
who can take on the most stress and
yeah,
still have a big bank account? Like,
yeah,
then you win America.
exactly. Or you get so rich that you become like a Zen master, like I don't know,
Yeah, I haven't heard
Elon
of
Musk
that
or
one.
something. I don't know. I mean, I
I think
think
he
like
got his money through holding a different mindset and perspective.
that's a good
I don't
point.
think he
Yep.
got his mindset from having all the money.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I've only seen a couple of interviews with him, and he's a pretty peculiar person.
Yeah.
He definitely spends a lot of time with information being bombarded into his consciousness.
Yeah.
That
I
I'm
think
sure.
he's just a really good self promoter as well.
Yeah,
As far as it's like, no one else can do this. I can do this.
he doesn't hold himself to limits,
Yeah.
and it doesn't seem to come off with arrogance.
Yeah.
It's just like, no, I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
um, and I did notice, like, I had heard about it way later than everyone else, I guess. But he had all these flamethrowers that he made.
Yeah.
You heard about that? Okay.
Yeah.
When I had heard about that, I looked into it. And the thing that I saw where he was talking about it is he was like, no, I thought that was a terrible idea. I told people, like, you shouldn't buy this. Where I was like, well, then why did you do it? And then he was like, later in that talk, he was talking about how, like, yeah, we were looking for more funding for this, so we figured we did. I guess they sold hats or shirts or something and made a
Yeah.
bunch of money. And then he was like, well, if we sold like 20,000 of these flamethrowers at 5,000 each, it's like there's $10 million.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay, you found something that people would buy to give you $10 million. Nice move. Like, that was a smart
Yeah.
business play.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it gets back to like self promotion, also having kind of a finger on the zeitgeist, I would say, of like the culture. It's like, yeah, people
Hmm.
like shirts and stuff, but you know what? People really like flamethrowers.
Yeah. To feel powerful and
Yeah.
destructive.
Yeah. Especially, I don't know. It is kind of crazy though that he went, so far out of the realm of his companies for that, where it's like, it wasn't a car, it wasn't even anything with wheels. It was just, you
Yeah.
know, this like super soaker for fire, essentially. Like,
Yeah. My understanding of it was they just took like a model of a roofing torch and just put like a nozzle on the tip to concentrate the beam.
not really.
Yeah, like it probably cost them next to nothing.
Yeah.
Like, it was a
It,
smart financial play. A crazy thing to do, but
yeah. They just slapped Tesla on the side and was like, oh, now it's a
yeah,
Tesla.
yeah. um, yeah, there was a whole bunch of things I had in my head on our way down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But I would love, absolutely love to hear, if you don't mind sharing, about what your current research is about.
Yeah. Feel like I just got home, so been having to explain this to all my family members. So I'm getting good at my elevator talk these days.
Nice.
Um,
And
so
I want to add, before you give your elevator speech,
yeah,
what I would really like to hear about, and it might be totally unrelated to your research, is what you're interested in. Because I
yeah,
know some people, they get like a research opportunity that's like pretty close to what they're interested in, but it's hard to like, because a lot of times for me, like the things I'm interested in are a little ambiguous. It's like I
yeah,
couldn't get funded research for that, but I would like to do my own studies on this. That if there's something that you are passionate about, and it could be related or not to
yeah,
what you're studying.
yeah, definitely. There are a few like fields that I follow pretty closely that I don't necessarily do research on, but I think are really important. Um, but there are some like ethical dilemmas with that. But so I can either start there, I can start with
Yeah,
what I'm currently
whatever
doing.
feels good.
Okay. I think I'll go with my research first, and then
Awesome.
I'll
Yeah,
tell you
we'll
what
just follow
some
that
other
where it
stuff.
goes.
Um. Okay. So I the lab I joined is interested in human development, but specifically on enhancers. So enhancers, you've got your standard gene that's like a promoter, and then the protein coding region of the gene. And so the promoter is really good at recruiting the proteins that are actually going to read that gene. Um,
And when you say proteins, are these like just links of amino acid or certain amino
yeah.
acids?
So
I
these
don't
are,
understand how all this works very well, but I'm going to ask
yeah,
questions because I want
yeah, no, go for it.
to.
So there are specific proteins called polymerases. And so what the polymerases do is they attach to the DNA and then run along and then essentially read the DNA and then are able to bind like corresponding RNA subunits to that DNA. So like if it reads and there are four basic like DNA units A,
Mhm.
T, G, C. So polymerase will be running along and it'll come across a T and it will then bind a RNA subunit A to it, and then it'll come across a G, and it'll bind an RNA subunit that's a C, and then so on. And so essentially, you know, you don't want to be messing around on the DNA that much. So I think of it as like you've got this old book that you need to read from and like copy off of, but you don't want to be turning the pages a bunch. So that's where RNA comes in, where it's like a temporary copy of that DNA that can be is more easily transported, and it's easier to make a protein from RNA than it would be if you were trying to make it from DNA. Um, so yeah, central dogma of biology is kind of DNA goes to RNA, and then RNA is translated into protein.
Okay.
Um, and so and then you have proteins that are then reading the DNA, and so it all gets really complicated very quickly because it's not such a clear cut circle.
If only.
Yeah, we would have figured stuff out
Yeah,
like
or we wouldn't be
already.
complex enough to figure it
Yeah,
out.
exactly.
It's a nice
Um,
paradox there.
yeah. so so basically, all the cells in your body have the same DNA. So you came from a single cell, and basically your DNA has just been copied a bunch of times in each one of your cells. So that kind of begs the question, okay, all of your cells have the same DNA. Why aren't all of your cells the same?
Yeah.
And so the way that life kind of solved that issue was regulating gene expression, essentially. So even though you have all the same DNA, not all of it is going to be read in every cell. So that's where enhancers come into
Hmm.
play. So enhancers, you've got your promoter, which is just a stretch of DNA that is not going to be made into a protein, but these polymerases like to bind to promoters. Um, and so,
Do they like to bind to promoters more than is this separate from any other DNA? What's special about a
yeah,
promoter?
it's a special sequence that is really amenable for polymerase binding. Um,
What was that word? Admittable?
pol- amenable, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, I'm unfamiliar with this word.
Oh, just like
It's probably a standard word. I just don't know
it's
it.
easy for it to bind to the configuration of the protein likes that DNA sequence essentially.
Okay.
Um,
And that DNA sequence is the same or different from the other cells of your body?
it's going to be the same. So
Okay.
you'll have the same promoters, the same genes. Um, part of it, which I guess is tangentially like important to my research as well. This is actually what I did a lot of my undergrad research on was so your DNA is just not like nakedly like floating around in the nucleus. It's actually really compacted in a lot of ways. You've got like 2 meters of DNA per cell, and it needs to
Whoa.
be yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, so there's like a size issue. It needs to be compacted into like a 6 micrometer nucleus. So basically, you need to coil this DNA, and so the way the cells have done that is we have these proteins called histones, which kind of look like balls. They're like yeah, like globular, and the DNA will wrap around it, and
Hmm.
then the histones can come together and form coils, and then that's where you see like the chromosomes from like textbooks
Okay.
and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but one way that those histones are involved in gene regulation is when you have a bunch of histones really close together, it's hard for that DNA to be um, accessed by polymerases. And so there are proteins that move and like slide the histones across the DNA to either open up regions of DNA or close them.
Okay.
And so that's actually a whole field called epigenetics, essentially.
Oh, okay. I've heard of epigenetics. I just didn't know that much
Yeah, so
detail of it.
we can inherit some of this histone spacing from our parents and from our environment. Um, so, anyway, So back to enhancers
Thank
though.
you for that, though. No, that was awesome.
Yeah, sure.
I'm loving this.
Yeah, yeah, you're getting the whole chromatin biology like crash course
I'm
here.
so
Yeah,
appreciative that you're sharing
yeah,
this with me. I think about this stuff all the time. I just don't know it.
yeah. No, this is like pretty new stuff. I would say maybe um, it's probably 25 years old, 30 years old since we really had any idea that this was really going on. Um, and then there's like even more work being done on, you can modify these histones so that they're either more attracted to the DNA or less attracted, and then that also, influences the sliding.
Yeah.
um and one of the ways that like the nucleus is kind of, or the DNA is really subdivided, is by these different modifications on histones, that kind of say like, okay, this region, don't read any stuff in here. Like, this is a junkyard. This is the really important stuff. So we're gonna, put some marks here to say like, make this gene as often as we can. And um, so that's kind of the way that we've been able to map a lot of the protein coding regions versus like junk DNA, is based on these histone modifications.
And are the histone modifications that's different in every cell?
Uh,
In
that's a
theory,
good
anyway.
question. Yeah, I would say
That's not
maybe.
fixed.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You could be having. There are different proteins that will, add marks, erase marks, or change marks, essentially. So, and that's all based on environment, on the cell type, on your like parents, because you inherit some of the histone marks from your mother, I think. Um, so basically, the father's ones are wiped out, but you still retain some of the mother's
Hmm.
histone marks. So anyway, so enhancers. So you got your promoter and you've got your gene, um, and let's say there are no histones around, so it's pretty open.
Okay.
Um, so the promoter is pretty good at recruiting polymerases to come and bind to it. But you don't want that happening, willy nilly all the time, especially if it's a really important gene. Like, a lot of the genes we study are involved in development for like limb growth. So you don't want, you want limbs to be growing at certain points, but you don't want,
Yeah.
a
You'd
limb
like that
growing
one
out
to
your
be
chest.
fairly consistent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you want, five fingers and, or not five fingers. You want 10 fingers, hopefully.
Yeah.
um, and like 10 toes, and you don't want to like start screwing that up.
Yeah, and you
Um,
don't want your fingers to be as long as your arm. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of the mice, when you start messing with these things, specifically like SOX2, which is just a developmental gene, uh, involved in limb growth, they have like paws, but then they have no limbs, so they're essentially like a like little burrito, and then they have like just
so they have
little.
hands attached to where their shoulders are.
Exactly, yeah,
There's no arm.
yeah,
Hmm.
um, yeah. They're, I think it's called. They're like serpentine mice or something. That's like, yeah. They didn't use the burrito terminology that I'm using, but yeah.
There's going to
um,
be a headline somewhere that has that,
yeah,
though.
yeah. Burrito mice. So what enhancers do though is, basically, so promoter and gene are really close together, but the enhancer can be as far as, a mega base away, which is essentially a million ATGs and Cs, whereas the promoter is maybe like
Oh,
three or
wow.
four.
Wow.
Um, so what ends up happening is the enhancers are really, really good at recruiting polymerases. So the current thinking, in the field, is that the enhancers actually loop around and then actually make contact with the promoter in order to recruit some of these like polymerases to read the gene.
And when you say in
Um,
order to recruit, does the enhancer grab the polymerase and then come to the promoter, or does when it makes contact with the promoter that therefore tracks the polymerase?
yeah, so once it makes contact with the promoter, it's recruiting. I'm not sure like how well the timeline is really figured out
Yeah,
for
it'd be
this.
kind of hard to look at that.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, we don't even know if these loops actually happen. We have some evidence, but no one's been able to like have a picture and say, "Oh, there's a DNA loop,"
Yeah,
because um,
that would be
which,
really hard to do, I would
well, in
imagine.
theory, we could do it, but it's just the thing is like the time that they're looping and then coming apart is like so short
Hmm. That you'd
that
have to
it's
be
hard.
looking in the right place at the right time.
Exactly. What we have done is like we'll put like a blue light or like something that um, emits blue light
Hmm.
on the promoter, and then say something that emits yellow light on the enhancer, and then we can see in cells like, oh, there's green light here, so that must mean that like the yellow and the blue have come together in the same space. That's about the closest I think we've gotten um, so far. The other theory, which like everyone, the like hot issue in biology right now is this thing called phase separation, um, which is just saying that within the nucleus there are different kind of bubbles, or like oil and water, things of different viscosity, like droplets of different viscosities and different properties that are constantly moving around, and that maybe the enhancer and the promoter aren't actually touching, but they're just in the same bubble for a little bit. Um,
Hmm.
so basically, like everything, you can go to a bunch of different talks now, and if they can't figure something out, they'll say, "Well, it's probably phase separation." So that's
And
like
and
the
phase separation, is that the latter of what you just described of like the different
yeah,
viscosities,
exactly, yeah,
like an emulsion mixture,
yeah,
and once you're
exactly.
in the same bubble of oil, for instance, that information just jumps.
Yeah, you're recruiting the polymerases to that bubble because the enhancer is there, and oh, the promoter's there now too. So it's getting the polymerases are now
Okay.
binding to
And
the
people are kind
promoter.
of defaulting to that because
It's just a new
it
idea.
appeases an assumption.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this would make a lot of sense, and I think it came out like 3 years ago that there were these different phases within the nucleus, and so now everyone's like, oh, well, that must be it.
Yeah.
It's kind of
All
like
right.
dark energy in physics, where it's just like, well, we don't totally have a great idea of what's going on, so it's probably dark energy. So
Yeah, it's
um,
the I don't have an answer, so I'll put this thing on there because no one really understands that well
yeah, exactly. It's
enough.
like no one's going to be like, no, it's not phase separation, because
Because they
it's
don't
like,
know it
well,
well enough
yeah,
to deny it. So, but
yeah,
it very well could also be exactly what it is, though, and we just don't
yeah,
understand it well.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think now that we know that it's a thing, there are a lot of exciting techniques that are being developed in order to better tease apart. So we don't have to say everything we don't understand is phase separation, essentially.
That's
um,
awesome.
yeah, I think it's definitely a pretty interesting time to be in this field.
Oh,
As far as just because the nucleus is just so much more complicated than we originally thought. Um, you know, we're finding more and more that, well, for a while people said like if it's not a protein coding gene, then it's crap. Like it's not. It's just genetic junk. And we're finding more and more like actually a lot of these things that don't necessarily make proteins but make RNA are actually really really important for protein functions, for disease, for all kinds of things where before they were just kind of thrown in the garbage bin. Um,
Yeah, my personal perspective is the human body is not doing anything inefficiently.
Yeah,
Like, it's way too complex to just have junk floating around on any
yeah,
level. It's going to
yeah, and I
recycle
mean,
and reuse and have a purpose, or it's going to get rid of it.
yeah, I mean that's natural selection right there.
Right,
It's like
right.
if it's not doing any good, then like it's probably going to be tossed out at some point. Um, I will say there is some junk DNA that actually, basically, you don't want a bunch of UV damage hitting your nucleus and messing up the DNA. So the way that the nucleus is kind of organized itself is it puts a bunch of junk DNA at the periphery of the nucleus, so it gets hit by the UV, and it's like, okay, well, luckily it was just like the trash DNA that got hit.
Yeah.
Um, so just crazy how like
Sacrificial DNA.
yeah, exactly. But like, how did that evolve to happen? I really have no
No.
idea. And like, where are the kind of what kind of DNA stretches would go in there, and how was that decided? That's just a whole other field of study that someone eventually will look into, like evolution of the nucleus and evolution of chromatin structure. But for right now, we're just trying to understand what the hell is going on.
That sounds
Yeah.
like my life.
Yeah.
Eventually, someone will figure this out, but right now, I'm just trying to understand what's
Yeah.
going on.
um so yeah, that's basically the field that I'm in. But I've also watched a lot of this CRISPR technology that's been coming out in the past couple of years. So the gene editing. If you I can give you a quick rundown of like
Please.
CRISPR if you want.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar.
So CRISPR Cas9, which it CRISPR stands for, geez, closely. Okay, I might just have to look this
Ask
up.
Google.
I always forget the acronym.
I'm terrible with acronyms.
Okay, clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. Which means nothing essentially, but
I'm sure it means something, but it might not give me any
yeah.
answers.
And then Cas9 is just like CRISPR associated proteins essentially. Um, so CRISPR was actually discovered as a way that bacteria have an immune system. Um,
Hmm.
so, in multicellular uh, organisms, we have specific cells that, you know, like white blood cells that are looking for pathogens to then, eat up and destroy. But,
Yeah.
if you're a single cell, it's not like you have, smaller cells inside looking for viruses.
Yeah.
So what the bacteria evolved was CRISPR. So what CRISPR does is, um, if a bacteria would get infected with a virus, one virus, and hopefully it's able to recognize that and chop it up before it gets infected and like has to explode from making too much virus. So when it's cutting it up, it'll actually save a fragment of the viral DNA as like a kind of a wanted poster. Um, so if any more of that virus comes into the bacteria, it's like, oh, we've seen you before. And so what CRISPR does, um, or Cas9, actually the protein, it's able to um, you know, look through all these wanted posters that it's accumulated over the years, and then it just goes around and scans DNA that's in the bacteria, and if it comes across that, it'll chop up the DNA at those regions.
Hmm.
So that's how it was founded, essentially, and we've now, it's pretty cool. We've got this programmable protein that can cut DNA where we tell it to cut DNA. Um,
And that's
and
something that we're able to manipulate, like as people.
Yeah, so now we've moved it out of bacteria and it's in every single organism that we're genetically engineering. Um,
And was it already there, or did we take it from the bacteria?
no, we took it from the bacteria.
Neat. So it's like, hey, you have a cool tool. We're going to use that over here.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, like good job, guys. Like,
I'm going to
we'll
borrow
take it off your
that.
hands. Yeah, it's like, wow, that was pretty smart of bacteria. Um,
Wow.
so we've now figured out ways to not only cut DNA. So we've made because it uses RNA as like a guide. Um, I think that's right. Anyway, so we've now given it pieces of actually it's got to be DNA, I think. So we give it pieces of DNA of where to target, and then we design these things that actually will then insert pieces of DNA that we want inserted at that site.
So take out
Um,
this chunk, put in this other one.
yeah, it's a little bit more complicated because you're actually relying on the cell to go through like a DNA damage response. And so it's like, oh shoot, our DNA's been cut. Looks around for like pieces of DNA that are floating.
And you're like, here you go.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, this was here the whole time, and the cell's like, oh okay, sure, like this seems to fit. Um, so that's essentially how we're able to do this gene editing now in a bunch of different organisms because we have CRISPR that can go to our gene of choice, remove stuff, insert stuff, move stuff around. So um, so that's been great. It's really allowed us to a lot of organisms that we weren't able to do gene editing on are now much easier to do that kind of editing. Um, in the past, one of the well, before CRISPR, we had these things called zinc finger nucleases, which essentially like it would cost $100,000 to make one zinc finger nuclease that would cut one area. Um, and so it was just widely or like totally
Impractical.
yeah, impractical for most people to do. Whereas CRISPR, all you really need is like a PCR machine, which costs maybe 5 grand. Um, and well, depends on what you're going to put it in, but it's pretty easy to make virus with CRISPR in, and then just inject it into the whatever organism you want and let it do its thing. So it's gone from like hundreds of thousands of dollars to you could probably get a kit if you had all the equipment.
You could do it at
It's
home.
yeah, exactly. I mean, and people have injected themselves with CRISPR. Um,
That's bold.
yeah,
Maybe
nothing
not. Not if
happened.
it's well calculated.
He was just doing it for show, but he was like, "Oh, I injected myself with it." And it's like, oh, "Okay, what do you do?" Um, the scarier thing was the recent CRISPR babies in China by that Chinese researcher he. So basically, I'm gonna say he. His name is actually his last name is he, but
Okay.
um, so I'm
I'll follow.
using the
I'll follow
pronoun. Yeah,
along. Yep.
yeah. um, so he did his graduate work um, at Stanford and then went to Vanderbilt, I think, and then went back to China for his to be a professor. And so his rationale, so there's been a global moratorium on gene editing humans for obvious reasons we don't really
Yeah.
understand it. And so what he did was he went to an HIV like AIDS help group and said, you know, if you want to have kids, like I can make sure that your kids don't have HIV or AIDS. And a couple,
Was that
um,
a legitimate claim?
so that's where No, not really.
Okay.
So
Maybe
the
he
gene,
believed it though.
yeah, there's evidence that so the gene that he wanted to knock out, or it's actually a variant of a gene called CCR5, and it's involved in how HIV is able to bind to your white blood cells and then essentially hijack them to screw up your immune system and then propagate. And so I think like within Europe, something like 0.1% of people naturally have that variant already. So he was saying, it's naturally occurring. These people don't seem to be able to be infected with HIV. Um, Strangely enough, though, like it is completely absent in Asian populations,
Hmm.
which could mean that it's actually important for fighting off some other virus or disease that's actually more common in
Yeah.
Asia. So, he went in, and when they're doing this gene editing, it's always going to be they do in vitro fertilization. So they take sperm and egg and then combine them in a test tube. They then screen the fertilized eggs to look for where the gene was edited. So they inject the CRISPR virus or virus containing CRISPR that will then go in and cut the DNA and remove the part of the CCR5 gene that they think is required for the HIV virus to dock. Um, and so losing my train of thought. So yeah, they'll screen single cells from the embryos and say, okay, like we've knocked out this gene, and then they implanted those embryos into the mother. She got pregnant and had twins, and um,
And that's
basically,
not an identical twin because they had implanted multiple eggs.
yeah, I don't think they were identical
Yeah, I
twins.
would imagine it would be because of multiple eggs because they, in my
Yeah,
understanding, typically when
yeah,
they
they
add
shoot a bunch in
multiple
and hope.
just
Yeah,
for the increased likelihood of one of them attaching.
yeah. Um, so and the other thing is like the way that he so, in the scientific community, the way you release findings is you publish a paper, it's peer reviewed,
Hmm.
and then it's finally published in a journal. And then that's when people are able to like look through all of your data and say, oh, okay, I accept these claims or I don't.
Right.
So, what he did instead was they were having this big like meeting in Europe to talk about CRISPR editing. So like Jennifer Doudna was there, who was like one of the first people who like found CRISPR essentially.
Okay.
Um, David Baltimore, who's been like the head of Harvard's like biology department for years and like won a Nobel Prize when he was like 36 or something. Anyway, so heavy hitters in the field were there. Um, so he gets up on stage, and this was just after like some talks about why we need to do more research before we start editing humans. And he gets up and is like, "Oh, so I made this YouTube video, so let's watch this." And it's basically just an interview with him explaining what he did, and no data, nothing, just like interviews with him explaining like his rationale behind it, and then saying like, "Oh, and these babies were born." Um, and then he just didn't take questions, didn't do anything, just like left. And so people were just pissed off essentially.
Especially when he's speaking to a crowd that is has gotten to the level it has by following these standards and these protocols.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, by the way, like mad scientist in a basement over here. Like, see you later.
Yeah.
That's
And
nutty.
yeah, no, it was like a huge thing. Jennifer Doudna actually, I went to one of her talks and someone brought it up, and she was like, "Yeah, he like emailed me when I was on a plane saying like, hey, I'm going to announce this,' and her and the other um, facilitators of the talks were like, well, should we even let him up there? And at the end of the day, they were like, it's going to come out one way or another. Might
Yeah.
as well have it come out at this conference. So anyway, so things actually get worse from there. So he goes back to China. The Chinese government were like, "Oh, well, that wasn't very cool," and he like loses his professorship and has now disappeared. Um, they
China
refuse to let.
style.
Yeah, I
Yikes.
think he's probably just working in a government lab. Honestly, I don't think he actually disappeared, but or was killed or anything.
Right, but when you just disappear, that it leads to a lot of unknowns.
Yeah,
You can fill in the
but
blanks with anything you want.
yeah, and basically they refuse to let any international scientists come and look at the kids. They it's just been a bunch of like Chinese physicians saying like, no, they're fine, like don't worry about it. And it's like, well, we'd like to do some testing to see like, how many off-target effects of CRISPR were there, because CRISPR isn't perfect. CRISPR, makes mistakes, and hopefully those mistakes are in the junk DNA, um,
Yeah.
but maybe they're not. So, and the other thing that came out maybe a week and a half ago was, so they did this huge study about the CCR5 variant that they gave these kids, and essentially found that it correlated to a 20-year decrease in lifespan.
Hmm.
Um, Meaning that obviously like that gene was probably pretty important for a bunch of other stuff like in normal functioning humans. Um oh, and I didn't bring this up, but so it wasn't even that they were at high risk of getting HIV. So
Oh.
um the father had HIV, but the mother did not. And basically that happens that happens quite a bit. And the way that they just do a C-section to make sure that there's no cross contamination between like the father and the kids, and then they're fine. Like they won't have HIV.
So we already
Um,
had a way of preventing that.
exactly.
That his means were totally unnecessary.
Yeah, that's what's essentially come out now. It's just like
Oh, so
he was
it's
doing.
the plot thickens.
Yeah, it's like it would make sense if like they were, his parents had Huntington's disease or something, and they were going in and making sure that the kids didn't have Huntington's, which is like caused by a single gene. We know what it does, we know what it should normally do, and that would have been, a much better candidate, um, than this gene that, tangentially prevents HIV.
In
Um,
theory.
yeah, which, but obviously does some other very important stuff. So it's just, you know, I I think we really need to come together globally and say, these are the guidelines, and we're not going to push the envelope anymore until we know exactly what these genes do. Um, and also just developing better, once we develop more accurate CRISPR systems that have less off-target effects, I think the case for using it on humans will increase.
Mhm.
Um, because eventually, I wouldn't say like you know, um, a moratorium on it for the foreseeable future is necessarily valid. I think eventually, because this could do a lot of good, for a lot
Yeah,
of people with genetic
there's a ton
diseases.
of potential,
Yeah,
but that potential goes in every direction.
yeah,
So until we can kind of guide it a little more accurately, that's
yeah.
some risky waters to be swimming in.
And then the other thing that came up in the talk that Jennifer Doudna gave, or Dudna, was, so there's actually been some work on, not necessarily for weaponizing CRISPR, but it would be I mean, they're putting it under the auspices of like population control for like rats and stuff. But there are these things that they've developed called gene drives, and so gene drives essentially, um, so they've showed that they can do it in mosquitoes so far to try to prevent mosquitoes from carrying malaria.
Hmm.
Um, it sounds really good, and I think they probably should be used on mosquitoes. But so what gene drives do is you basically insert, um, you have CRISPR insert itself into like DNA that will then make CRISPR or Cas9, I guess. So Cas9 cuts out DNA and then inserts the DNA that will make Cas9. And then it also,
Which leads to just like it's kind of hijacking the DNA to create more of itself.
so what it really does is like super Mendelian inheritance. So, normally you have two copies of a gene and, you know, say you're X, Y, not gen, or okay, A, B, and you cross someone, like you have kids with someone who's A, B, you know, 1/4 of your kids will be A,
Yep. Yep.
half will be AB, and a fourth will be BB.
BB. Right.
So what CRISPR does, say that you, um, rather than A being a uh, normal gene, it's you use a gene drive on A. So you do the cross again, and you get AA, but then for the kids who have AB, the A gene is going to make CRISPR that then cuts out B and
And
replaces
replaces
it
with
with A.
A. So then you
So then
get
you're
three
going
quarters of AA and then one
one
quarter of BB.
BB, yeah. And then as that goes through the generations, eventually you're just going to have all AA.
Yeah,
Um,
just because probability wise it'll weed
yeah,
itself
unless
out.
you're like, um, you know, unless you're on Iceland and it's like everyone's having kids with their cousins and stuff. But yeah, um,
Does that happen in that culture more?
they have such a small gene pool that they actually have an app that tries to look and see like how closely related
Oh
everyone
wow,
is because yeah,
interesting.
a lot of inbreeding in Iceland.
I mean, if the
Um,
population is small enough, it's bound to happen. Once it
yeah,
branches out, it'll not have anywhere else to go.
yeah. So at least they're doing something about it. But so yeah, so gene drives. I think you can see where, say, there's a gene that you want us to push through a population that will stop mosquitoes from having malaria. That could be done pretty quickly. You would just release, you know, 10,000 of these gene drive mosquitoes into an area and then give it, 10 years or something. And eventually, because the
It'll
mosquitoes will
breed
breed
out
really
the other
quickly. Yeah.
ones. Yeah, yeah.
Um, but you can think of it like you could do more nefarious stuff with that, which,
This is another word I'm not unfamiliar with.
like bad, like,
Okay.
um, evil,
That's good enough.
evil stuff. Like, I mean, with humans, it would be the good thing about us is that we have like a really long gestation. Like, it takes a long time for a baby to get to sexual maturity.
Hmm.
So it's not going to be 10 years. It's going to be like, if you put a gene drive into a human population, it'll take 1,000 years or something to
Yeah,
spread,
because it'd
depending on
have to
how
go
many.
through so many iterations.
Yeah. But if you start off by infecting like, you know, uh, a million people off the bat, then you can slowly decrease that time scale.
Hmm.
And so that could be an issue. I mean, hopefully you would be spreading something like, um, better immunity to certain diseases or something, or increasing people's ability to fight cancer by having better variants of this housekeeping genes essentially. But you could also see where um, you could increase or you could use CRISPR to decrease the reproductive fitness of a population over time.
Hmm.
Um, so if you said like, "Oh, I hate Norwegians" or something, you could just you know somehow infect a bunch of Norwegian people with this CRISPR virus, and then you know it wouldn't show up immediately, but slowly their birth rate would decline to the point where you could essentially just wipe them off the map in
Hmm.
this very slow moving like genocide essentially. Which it was brought up with Jennifer Doudna, and she was like, not that particular example, but just the fact that this could be used for really nefarious things. And she was like, I don't care, like, or she didn't say I don't care, but she said I don't think we should talk about um, you know,
The
use.
misuse.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
because you're just going to give people ideas of how to use it for that,
Right.
but at the
That
same
to
time,
me, it's like looking at a vehicle, like a car or a truck. It's like trucks are super practical. You can move a lot of things. You can transport yourself through physical space really quickly and conveniently. You could also run through a crowd of people with a truck and run a
yeah,
bunch of people over. It's like, but that's not what we use them for. Like,
yeah,
we don't need to talk about running people over when we're talking about how are we going to move these materials from A to B.
yeah,
That
exactly.
there's practical application, and then there's misuse of anything. And I think
Yeah,
that it's there's just everyone is affected by their genetic makeup. That it's like, whoa, what do you mean? Because I live somewhere away from where trucks are, I'm not worried about anyone running me over with a truck. But like,
yeah,
you're telling me that genes could be misused? That's a scary thought for people.
yeah, yeah, and it's like I think of it as like atomic weapons or like atomic energy, essentially. Before the atomic bombs were made, no one knew about radiation or the effects of
Yeah.
radiation on humans or anything like that. It just wasn't something that people were worried about, so there wasn't no one had like suits to stop radiation. People
Hmm.
were getting X-rays done like willy nilly because it was just like, oh, like I'm
Yeah.
sure it's fine.
I want to see inside of me. This is a cool way to do
Yeah,
it.
yeah. People were painting watches with what was it, radium or something, and losing fingers because they were painting their nails with radioactive finger polish and stuff. So
Hmm.
um, I just think like the more we talk about it and say like, yeah, there's a lot of good can be done with this, but we need to keep in mind that um, there are going to be bad people eventually who figure out how to do some like pretty bad stuff with this. And
Right, and that's I think where he might have brought to light some of the areas that may have not had enough structure around them.
yeah,
Where in an example similar to that but totally unrelated is there's all these laws on flying drones,
yeah,
and drones using the airspace and different like legal things around that. Because when drones first came out with cameras on them, people were like flying them into their neighbor's yard and like filming their neighbors in their backyard and doing all of these things that it wasn't illegal because it wasn't a thing to make illegal before.
yeah,
And there was no guidelines of like, hey, this is how we can do it in an ethical manner because it didn't exist. Like,
yeah,
so it was unnecessary to have any ethical guides for something that no one could do. But now we're
yeah,
finding out, hey, we can do this stuff. Let's pause, hit the pause button, and let's figure out what direction would be beneficial
yeah.
and what restrictions would be beneficial.
Well, and the thing is, like, there's not really. I mean, there are international science bodies, but it's like China essentially. They don't play by the same rule books
Yeah.
as American researchers. And the thing is, if you genetically modify a bunch of birds or something, like they're not going to stop at the Chinese border or something. They'll migrate out.
They don't have
Um,
passports.
yeah, exactly. It's like we're when you're dealing with nature, you can't. It either needs to be a global law that everyone follows, otherwise, it's just not going to be enforceable.
Hmm.
Um, which is frightening. I think that, and it really wouldn't take, as these things get cheaper and cheaper. You know, you're not going to need a state-run uranium like purifying. You're not going to need like Iran's nuclear capabilities with all that money to do some real damage. You'll need 10 people in a shitty lab in a
Someone's
basement
garage
somewhere.
lab, yeah.
Yeah, some centrifuges and some pipettes and a bunch of mosquitoes or something, and you're and like a couple years, maybe 2 or 3 years, and yeah, you could. It's not trivial. You don't need a uranium mining organization to like do some really bad stuff. And until there starts to be like even right now, I think there's no monitoring of what people are ordering as far as like synthetic genes. I think certain like um, toxins that can be produced from certain genes are monitored, but other than that, like no one's really looking like what genes are they trying to throw into these things. Um, and so eventually that's going to need to be taken care of because, and it's probably going to take some like terrible thing happening before people wake up and say like, you know, this is actually a problem that needs to be looked at.
Right, and there's this. I don't want to call it a stance. I don't have the right word for it, but I'm going to use stance for the sake of continuing this thought.
Okay.
There's a stance I've been taking on how to overcome, I'll say, like ethical dilemmas or moral dilemmas or the progression of human interaction and behavior. In that you're like like you just said, we're having to wait for these like catastrophic, horrific events before people take action. And that's that's not a preventative measure. That's like we'll wait until it gets really bad and then we'll see if we can clean up the mess and there will
Yeah.
be casualties along the way. Where in my mind it's like that's not a very smart approach.
Yeah.
We could lose a lot of valuable resources or lives or whatever you end up losing in this event. Where the piece that I'm concerned about, this is me personally, of like where I'm trying to find things to spread and not enforce, but um, offer to become commonplace is good intention
Yeah.
and guided intention, because misguided good intention, you get things like World War II, where
Yeah.
Hitler wanted like a pure world, like devoid of evil. Guess what? You can't get that by doing evil things.
Yeah.
So that was misguided good intention, which turned into a horrific event that had to be cleaned up. So it's not just getting everyone on page with good intention, because everyone's self-preserving. We're all trying to like make things better for us and survive. It's just an innate drive of life. But there's got to be some foundation of like when we're clear of stress, when we're not stressed, we act communally, we act together, and we look to expand and grow. When you're under stress, you're looking to defend and survive.
Yeah.
And from that stance, again, like maybe if everyone had mindfulness, you wouldn't have people trying to wipe out other gene pools.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Exactly.
that
I
there's
think there's definitely a prevailing sense of like the ends justify the means in a lot of these situations where it's like it doesn't matter how we get there. Like World War II is a perfect example, but
Yeah. If anyone's
um,
telling me it doesn't matter how we get there, I probably don't want to be on their team.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly what he did. Um, where it was like, I'm pushing. His whole thing was like, I'm pushing science forward by taking these steps. Um, you
Mm.
know, and it's a
I
perfect
mean,
thing where it's like,
true, because the
yeah,
science community has to rebuttal.
yeah, but
But his actions, I again don't justify the means. I don't think that just because you're pushing the current field means your actions are ethical.
yeah. Well, and he didn't do anything radically new either. So like we had IVF already, and we already knew that we could do gene editing on human cells, human embryos. But no one put those two things together and said, "Okay, I'm going to gene edit up an embryo and then I'm going to implant it." Everyone else stopped before implantation. And he was just like, it's like, so he didn't add anything to the debate, or he didn't add anything novel, really. It was just kind of, he was willing to cross boundaries that no one else was
Yeah,
going to
now I'm
do.
going to take this action into a human life.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I don't know what the best way, especially with, China wanting to really push forward in science. And they've had now like countless examples of where they've either done unethical science or just irreproducible science. And so um, it's almost like the incentives are different for them, where it's, I just need to make a splash. It doesn't matter if it's ethical. It doesn't matter if the science is sound behind it. I just need to, get my name in international newspapers.
Yeah, looking for a ticket out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now he's gonna be stuck there, so um, for whoever knows how long.
Yeah, but
But
maybe he's living a life now that he's like, yeah, I did it. Now the big guys want me and have me working for them. Or maybe he's locked up in a room somewhere and they're like, we're not letting you do anything.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure there's,
A risk I'm
really
sure
good.
he had to know he was taking.
Yeah, no, he knew. The
That
thing
would
is, he's like, oh, I spoke with all these ethicists, and the ethicists like that he spoke with were like, yeah, I told him not to do it. Like, it's like, okay, yeah, he told the truth. He did speak with ethicists. He just didn't like take into account anything they said.
Yeah. No, like almost like, well, if you guys aren't with me, then like I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah,
'Cause-
and the videos, if you get the chance, just to watch the videos, he definitely comes off as like very. It's not patronizing, but it's like he has this almost god complex about it, where it's like, oh, and I've like changed the lives of these kids and like blah blah blah. And it's like, well, yeah,
Yeah,
you
but
definitely
not
did change
necessarily
their
for the
lives.
better. Like
Yeah,
you could go beat up a kid on a playground and yell at them, and that's going to change their life too.
yeah, yeah. And he was like, oh, well, like these already naturally occurred. And it's like, well, not in the population that you're editing
And
now.
they weren't
And
going to naturally occur
yeah,
without your intervention.
yeah. And it's like, even so, the lifespan thing is like a direct consequence, but who knows, like intergenerational effects, like, what if it just has a small effect on each generation and it adds up over time?
Yeah.
Um, these are the things where we just don't have data on that. And it's going to be really hard to get data on something like that. Um, so I think he definitely jumped the gun by like at least 20, 25 years as far as, when we would even be close to being ready to pull off something like that. Um,
With ethical and I'll call it educated
yeah,
accuracy.
yeah. I think an article came out today actually, where it was saying like, here are the here are the things that we need to get right before we start doing human gene editing, and it was like, intergenerational studies on genes that we're going to manipulate, better Cas9 systems that don't have off-target effects, if there are off-target effects, what's like the threshold we'll say that is like acceptable.
Hmm.
Um, what else? And then identifying genes that are actually don't have some other function, like the CCR5, where it's like, well, in a bad context, it helps HIV get in, but like in a good context, it could do any number of other things. And so maybe there are other genes that would confer an HIV resistance without, all these long-term consequences.
Yeah.
Um, and so all of those things, uh, I think we're the farthest from the intergenerational studies, and we're probably the closest on getting newer Cas9, uh, systems that are less error prone. Essentially, a lot of people have been working on that because it'd be a helpful tool because right now,
Oh yeah.
um, the error. I mean, the error isn't terrible, but you have a 1% error and you've got a billion letters in your genome. Like that's hundreds or if not thousands of uh, errors. So
Yeah. So this might be a naive question. Um, how many, I'll call them links, are there in a human DNA strand? Because you said it was
uh,
3 meters long, right? In each cell,
uh,
but
2 meters.
2 meters. Okay, but most of it's junk DNA,
Yeah, but they're all
but still has potential.
yeah. I mean, it's all ATs, Gs, and Cs. Um, but some of them just don't code for anything, like anything of use. Um, so there are 3.2 billion uh, base pairs in the human genome.
Okay, that's huge.
Yeah, so that's where like the error rate is just it's not a trivial thing when you're working with that kind of number. Essentially,
Yeah.
with yeast or something like I'm trying to think of the yeast genome. The yeast genome is something like a million, maybe. Sorry, I don't have these numbers.
No, that's fine. I don't either.
Okay, so yeah, it's like 2.2 uh thousand bases, so it's super small.
Oh wow,
Um,
that's tiny.
and I
But
think
just
bacteria is even smaller, actually.
going
But
back to, if you were saying that we have a 1% margin of error, and then you look at 3 billion
yeah,
pairs, okay, so we only have 30 million errors.
yeah,
That's a
exactly.
lot of errors.
Yeah,
You need a way smaller margin of error than 1% if you're working on a scale that large.
yeah, no, and I think I mean that's an issue even right now. As far as I think it's less than 1%. I think it's probably like 0.01 at this point. Let me
Okay, so 300,000 errors. That's still a
uh,
huge, huge margin of error to account for.
yeah. No, I mean, essentially, we would need like a 1 in a billion error rate for it to be
Yeah.
pretty useful. I mean, luckily, a lot of the off targets end up being in regions that we don't or we're not that interested in.
Yeah,
Um,
and may not have a noticeable impact for
yeah,
practical purposes.
yeah, exactly. Um, and we've taken CRISPR and made it into a lot of other useful stuff as well, besides like gene editing. So one of the things that we use it for is just its targeting, essentially. So if you want to see what proteins are floating around a certain stretch of DNA, we've developed ways to, you know, the Cas9 goes to that region of the DNA. It doesn't cut or anything; it just stays there, and then it can label all of the proteins in that region.
Oh,
Um,
that's
and then
cool.
you can yeah, and then you can like isolate those proteins and identify them and say, oh, okay, all these proteins were hanging out together in this, you know, 1 micron, or I think it's like 3 nanometer area around where Cas is. But then that even like the error rate is an issue there because now you're tagging proteins that are nowhere near the protein that you were interested in or the DNA you were interested in. So there's a like yeah, lots of different people are trying to push for better CRISPR systems, and a lot of that's being done through this thing called is it targeted evolution? Um, sorry, I'm blanking on the terminology.
That's one of my biggest weak points in my memory is names of things.
Yeah, it's just like that's
I'm
literally
great
all
at
biology
remembering
is now.
concepts. I'm really good at remembering experiential feelings. Um, but the names of things and things people said, yeah, it's not
Yeah,
not stored well in my memory bank.
yeah. Basically, like I can't think of the phrase, but it's um, directed evolution or something, where they essentially just make a bunch of different mutations in um, the gene that they're interested in, like CRISPR, and say just willy nilly, like they don't care where what gets mutated or not, and then they set up tests to look at which ones are working better than the normal like baseline, and then they take the mutated ones and then they mutate them again and say like the ones that are working better they um, take those and then mutate them again and see which ones work better than the ones before, and then so on and so on. And so you're almost letting
And when you're
nature.
saying they see if they work better, do you have to have that like back in starting at the base level cells of development, like let's use mice as an example or mosquitoes, and like run through their development again? Or can
So you
you write it and then like insert it and see an immediate change? Or how does that how's that being measured, I guess, or tracked?
so I think they probably do it in bacteria.
Okay.
So they're much smaller
Much
genome,
shorter, yeah,
and they can sequence the whole thing with like multiple like um the term for it.
iterations.
Yeah, iterations, but they're also getting like overlap between the sequences, so they're coverage essentially. They're getting multiple coverage of like the same base pairs, so they're sure that like it wasn't just a sequencing issue. And then they're able to look for how often was this off target. Okay, it's lower than the baseline, so let's move forward with these, and then they mutate them again, see like okay, did we get increased or decreased error rates, and then so that's been a lot of work. It's not like people are sitting there thinking like, oh well, how can I make CRISPR better? They're like, let's just like you know throw a bunch of junk in there and see if anything helps, and then just repeating that on and on. And
Yeah, so
just
it's
because
essentially just tossing more things into the fire to see how they
yeah,
burn.
yeah, it's like nature's a lot better at designing these things than we are, so let's just like help nature out by speeding up evolution a little bit.
Yeah, and by helping nature out, it's more of like let's see if we can get some influence in this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Some to guide the evolution
yeah,
essentially, which that I could see really stepping into the realm of ethical concerns.
yeah, um,
Because if we're not as smart as nature or not as good at these things as compared to nature, what right do we have to say this is a good direction for it to go?
yeah, yeah.
um,
Especially when you're like releasing these things out into
yeah, that's spooky.
yeah. Well, I mean, we've already done it with all these GMO corn, potatoes.
Right, and that's something that cracks me up all the time. Like I was eating some blueberries the other day, and I had one that was like it was pretty big, like
Yeah,
the size of a marble. And I was just laughing to myself, like anyone who's worried about like, oh, I don't eat GMO food. I'm like, well, then you like, do you go forage in like
Yeah, exactly.
untouched habitat somewhere? Because if you're eating anything from a grocery store, we've modified its genetic makeup through whatever means, depending on how long we've been going at it. Because advanced means, by today's standards, haven't been around,
Yeah.
but you look at the way they would cross pollinate and things like that. It was intentional genetic modification.
Yeah, I think it's something like what is it? Cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, um, like a bunch of our like staple vegetables all came from like the same original plant. It was just us forcing it into different directions, saying like, "Oh, I want this to be, white now.
I like
I
this
just want to eat the
trait.
flower."
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that's genetically modified too, and if anything, that's more genetically modified than we've done to anything else.
Right, right.
Um,
Instead of doing this small little sliver of it, I'm just gonna take these two and slap them together
yeah,
and continue to cross pollinate. And
yeah, it just took a lot longer.
yeah, it
um,
was an ineffective, more almost messy
yeah,
approach. That
yeah. So these people who are saying like, "Oh, GMOs cause cancer," it's what part
maybe.
of yeah? It's like I guess if you're injecting their DNA into you, then like probably, but it's probably the pesticides honestly that are causing the cancer.
Right.
So um, like
I
the
whenever I
DNA
hear
is
those claims, immediately just like a red flag goes off in my head, and it's like, no, they're uneducated.
yeah, yeah.
Like,
It's like
that's fine. Like, you can hold your opinions. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, but I'm not going to listen to you with much
you know,
weight.
it's like
Educate
that
yourself and then teach me.
the anti-vax movement as well. It's just like I I don't know. I think if anything, that's one of the more dangerous things going on these days, where it's like, polio doesn't seem that bad, so I'm not going to get my kids vaccinated. It's like talk to
And
someone from 60 years ago.
that's where I feel like, again, everyone's focused on like, oh, like, don't vax your kids, it'll lead to autism, or whatever their claims are and defenses for that stance are. I go back to, okay, why are you not protecting your kids? Is it because you're uneducated on the science of how vaccines work? Because they work, they're very efficient. Like, there's tons of evidence supporting that.
Yeah,
But then, sure, you could also say, well, I don't know where this vaccine came from and what it's actually composed of. And it's like, okay, well, if there's ill intention, it goes back to like, are people doing things for personal gain or personal curiosity with no consideration for others' lives? Or or is it like, no, I want everyone to live free of polio? So
yeah,
it's like, sure, you want to trust your sources. And if people cared about each other, they're not going to have that malicious, like, oh, watch this. I'm going to mess my brother up so bad. Like, I'm going to
yeah,
give him
exactly.
autism. Like, that's not something that
Yeah,
someone whose stress response is off, has like a good head on their shoulders, is going to be doing. And vaccines work.
yeah. Like, why would a drug company or a pharmaceutical company make something that is going to give people autism?
Yeah.
I
And
the
there's,
the logic behind
sure,
it.
it's there, that could be an unforeseen byproduct of some of these things, but I
Yeah,
think it's just, there might be more prevalence of autism than there was in the past. I don't know because I wasn't alive then. Um, but I feel like we just didn't have an understanding of people's quirks.
yeah,
Like, some people are different, and the autism is now a spectrum. And
yeah,
other things that used to be separate from autism, they've thrown onto the spectrum, and it's like, well, yeah, people are all different,
yeah.
and there's a
I think
lot of us.
yeah, exactly. It's like people were saying like, "Oh, everyone like no one used to have like cancer this frequently back in the past. Like, cancer is because of like the chemicals and stuff." And it's like, no, people just weren't living long enough to get cancer.
That's a great point too.
Like,
There's
people were
there's
dying from
too many
consumption.
variables. Yeah, you would die of other causes before you'd get to cancer. And
Yeah.
people may have died of cancer and they just didn't know because they didn't have any means of identifying it.
Yeah. Or like, with Alzheimer's, it's like, oh, people didn't used to have Alzheimer's. It's like, no, they just called it like, oh, he's senile now. Like they're
Right.
they're getting old. Like it
No, that's
wasn't
because of
common.
aluminum. I used aluminum foil when I baked something once, so now I'm going to get
Yeah.
Alzheimer's. And it's like,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. And like I know one of the main like anti-vax statements is like, oh, well, there's mercury in the like injection. It's like, okay, it's not it's not elemental mercury, first off. There's sodium, or yeah, there's like straight chloride or chlorine in table salt, but you're not dying from it because like
That's
it's
a
it
great
has a different
comparison.
structure now.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like such a low amount of mercury, and it's just used as a uh what's it called? Basically to like keep it from degrading over time. It's a preservative.
Okay.
So it's just, and I don't even think it's in most of the vaccines anymore. I think they've moved on because people were,
Freaking out.
up in arms about it. Yeah, it's like there's mercury. It's like, okay, well, there are a lot of things that have like,
We'll swap that out for a different preservative and then come to find out that it has worse effects.
yeah, exactly. We'll
But
switch
at
to
least
something
everyone's
that you,
happy about
yeah,
it.
it's like we'll switch it to something that no one's heard of, and you guys can settle down. Like,
Yeah, you can be the guinea pigs now instead.
yeah, it's just, I think there's definitely been a movement away from just trusting experts and scientists. Um, like in, I don't know, I feel like in the past 10 years, maybe. I don't know. I'm still pretty young, but
Yeah.
I
We're
think,
not that young anymore though, which is kind of funny, isn't it?
yeah,
Like, look at us. We both have beards now. Last time,
yeah,
remember, we were like little kids with boogie boards on the beach.
yeah. That's true. Yeah, I'm feeling older.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think growing up, it was always like, oh, the scientist said this, so like, we'll trust them. And now it's like, oh, well, I went on Google for like, a few days, and I think I know better than the scientists now, and like,
Yeah,
I
and
essentially have a PhD.
that's interesting to look at. Is like everyone has this incredible access of complex information. You can study anything from your personal computer if you have internet access.
Yeah,
Um, but that doesn't mean you're well informed,
yeah,
and it definitely doesn't mean that you understand it. And a lot of it's misinformation.
yeah,
That's been someone's interpretation of it who wasn't well informed. That
yeah.
it's
It's like,
like there's tons of misinformation that people were like, let me just search WebMD and now I'm a doctor. It's like, not how
yeah.
that works.
Well, it's like, they're going on these blogs and stuff, and it's like, well, Sandra from Oklahoma said that like she vaccinated her kid and like now he has autism. It's like, okay, so you're getting one person's perspective. How about you like go on PubMed and you have access to it, like your tax money paid for it. Like go on there and just type in like, autism vaccinations, read those articles, and then come back and like actually, you're not going to be an expert on it, but you're definitely going to be better informed than listening to like, two people across the country who got on the internet to, you know, try to scare people.
Right.
Um,
And that's I love to hear your take on this. This is something that troubles me is why people don't read research.
yeah,
It's out there, it's accessible, and there are standards to it, and it has been measured and peer reviewed, and it has to be replicable. And it's not just someone making claims. Like they have to found it and show this is the percent error that we found. This is the level of significance that we found. This is who we tested. This is how we recruited them. This is how we tested them. These are our findings, and it's very measured and calculable.
yeah. I
And
think it
people
it
don't
gets
read it.
down to like scientific literacy, just in the U.S., abroad as well. People think science is boring, and they would rather someone spoon feed them whatever claims. Well, first off, I think people inherently have what's the word for it? Where essentially they have a bias towards
Confirmation bias.
confirmation bias. There we go. Psychology.
I
Uh,
actually just a talk a week or so ago was talking about that. I couldn't have the term, so I looked it up. That's why I remembered.
okay. Yeah, so I think confirmation bias is an issue, scientific literacy. And then also, I mean, a lot of these papers that are published are not written for
The
mainstream
layperson.
consumption. Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're going to read them, you really got to put in work and, have other web pages open where it's like, okay, they're talking about this gene. Well, what do we know about this gene? Or, how does, how are genes read and transcribed? Or, and then also like the statistical behind it, where it's like, you know, it might be significant, but maybe like there's already a bias within the sampling.
Right. And statistical significance can be misinterpreted very easily.
Yeah.
Um, that I was thinking about is like, oh, that would be a cool project to have like anyone who's like in undergrad or works in a research program or whatever to like be a part of any new research that comes out. You have like here are the main findings, and then I was like, oh nope, that would be risky move because that could be very misleading.
Yeah.
And if it's taken out of context, now it could lead to anything you want it to mean,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily true. Then it's like, okay, maybe it's just people aren't willing to put in that work. I'm someone who I like statistics. I know that is not the norm because most people tell
Yeah.
me they hate statistics and it was their
Yeah.
worst class in college, and it's like I love it. Do I trust someone who says the statistics show this? No. A lot of that's trying to influence someone to believe something. But if you understand statistics, you can look at some research and then you look at who was their population, how did they measure it, what measurements, statistical measurements did they use to interpret their results, and you can get a pretty good understanding of something that's actually now supported rather
Yeah.
than someone's opinion or their own interpretation of an experience.
Yeah.
That
Yeah. I think also just, you know, I think there's very different wording within scientific communities that doesn't really translate well. So no one's going to say, I'm sure that this is what's happening, or like I'm absolutely positive, like there's no way. Like even, experts in the fields, when they go to these conferences, they'll always like start off by saying, I'm sure there's someone else in the room who probably is better informed about this, but like here's what I think. Or
right.
like, there's ongoing research about it, but so far, like, or our results aren't conclusive, but like this is the findings that we have put out there. And for the layperson, they're like, oh well, it doesn't sound like they're really confident about like what's going on. So like if they're not confident about it, then why should I be? Whereas like, in a scientific lecture like that, if you say like, oh, I'm sure this is what's going on, you'll get torn apart by like
Everyone in
other
that
side.
room will no longer believe anything you say.
Yeah. Or they're like, oh, like, it's like I'm gonna take this guy down publicly because
Yeah.
I'm gonna show people that like he's not. If he thinks he's sure, then he's probably wrong or something.
Yep.
Um,
And that's something that exact point I think is highlighted in. I was talking to someone one time, and I had shared that I love statistics and like peer reviewed research, and they immediately went like, "Oh God, I know someone else who's just like that." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And I had known this person based when they mentioned who it was, and I was like, "Oh, I don't think that we're talking about the same thing now." Once they told me
yeah,
who they were talking about, and they're like, "Yeah, they always use statistics to talk about how like they prove this and like they know that for certain. It was like, oh, then that's not real. That's not the
Yeah.
statistics I'm talking about.
He's
If
just using statistics to
Yeah,
like
I'm
make
like,
himself.
if
Yeah.
something was proven by statistics, there's still that's the belief due that this happened not due to random chance based on these
Yeah.
manipulations, and it's a level of certainty which is never 100%. Um, and there's always that random chance that something else happened, and there's always a deeper level of other factors influencing it. Like
Yeah.
scientists have really good ideas about how certain things are happening, but I feel like they're one of the most skeptical populations,
Yeah.
which is what leads them to further understanding. But as every time you go to a deeper level of understanding, you're faced with I don't know what's under this.
Yeah.
So there's it's not a very confident population, but they're more well informed than the layperson,
Yeah.
who's extremely confident
Yeah.
due to
But
ignorance.
yeah. Yeah, and I think getting back to, the vocabulary, like you wouldn't like the amount of people who have told me, evolution's only a theory. It's like, well, yeah, because we can't mathematically model it,
Right.
it's by saying theory, it's not just like someone came up with it and there's no evidence for it. It's just we
Right.
weren't there at the beginning of life, so we haven't been observing it because we had to evolve too.
Yeah.
Um, and so just, you know, it's like, well, they call gravity like the law of gravity. Why isn't it the law of evolution? It's like because we can have controls about gravity, and we've been to places where there isn't gravity. We didn't have controls about evolution, and I mean, we've seen evolution happen in real
Hmm.
time. We've seen natural selection. Everything from I think the like classic example was there were these white moths living in London
Yep.
back in like the 1800s.
I forget the name of the moths. And then after,
It's like the Industrial Revolution or
yep,
something.
all
They
the like suet and ash on the trees, there was a change in the genetic makeup because they went dark to blend in to their habitat.
exactly, and it's like that's evolution in like a 10-year span.
Yeah, like an incredibly short period of time for something
Yeah,
to evolve.
to completely change its look. And you're saying, and it's like, well, the random chance behind like a human brain coming into existence is so small. How could it ever like happen? And it's like, well, it's a small chance, but we also had a trillion rolls of the die. So eventually you're going to get like double sixes or whatever, if you're just rolling it constantly for millennia.
Eternity.
Yeah, exactly.
I think what I've come to see in when people have an uproar about things like evolution, because I love science and I use science as a compass for me navigating my life. And a lot of people are like, well, I can't buy into the whole evolution thing. And to me, I'm like, well, there's a ton of evidence. That's a really easy one to track, and then you could use like examples of like, well, then what? How do you explain these moths? Um,
Yeah,
but what I've found is there's this resistance because it goes against their belief system
yeah,
that evolution can't exist. And I'm like, well, there's nothing saying it's separate from whatever other realities or foundations you have for your existence. Like, this is just something we've been able to map. Like,
yeah,
and
yeah,
no, we haven't been able to show the measurement of it in a way to not call it a theory, but that doesn't make it any less true. And it doesn't
yeah,
invalidate your experience. And if it does invalidate your experience, then I'm sorry to tell you, you're probably wrong.
yeah,
Um, and swallow that. Like, that's fine. I've been wrong about countless things in my life, and I'm wrong about some of the things I believe right now. Like, that's going to happen. I'm not a
yeah,
supercomputer.
yeah. And I mean, I think it comes back to confirmation bias, same
Yeah.
way, where it's just like this really doesn't jive with my how I
Model.
see myself in the world. Yeah, my model of the universe. And so, you know,
I'm gonna reject it.
I'm yeah, I'm definitely right. So, probably wrong. Um, speaking of, I'm gonna get on my soapbox a little bit, but it
Good.
does, kind of directly affect my research now. Is the recent ban on fetal tissue research? Have you heard about this?
I'm not in the literature.
Yeah. So basically, UC Berkeley went back to the NIH asking to continue their funding because they, you know, lots of researchers use fetal tissue for HIV studies. That's how we get our stem cells to do work on stem cell research. Um, Everything from development. If you want to do anything with human development, you have to use human stem cells.
Hmm.
And the current administration just said, sorry, but we're not going to renew it. So you guys can use the rest of the money, but you're going to need to stop. And the thing is, it's not like I think some people think it's like a supply and demand because yeah, you're getting the tissue from aborted fetuses, which like is a terrible thing that like that's the source.
I mean,
Um,
is it a terrible thing? I think that's a matter of perspective.
yeah, I mean it's just the optics of that I think are tough.
It, to
But
me, it would be a terrible thing if we were like forcefully impregnating women and then aborting those fetuses for the stem cells. That
exactly,
would be a terrible thing. I would,
yeah,
you would see me like protesting
yeah.
that.
Well, and
That's not what's happening.
it's not like the scientists are saying we need more, fetal tissue.
Right,
Let's call up
right.
the abortion clinic and tell them to get some more like abortions going.
Yeah, go recruit some pregnant
Yeah,
teens. Like that's not
exactly.
how that's working.
And it's like, the alternative now is just that tissue's getting, incinerated. No research is being done on it. It's
Hmm.
just, and the fact that it's like, oh, well, this is like for the sanctity of, human life. It's like, okay, if you really cared about human life, then you wouldn't, just toss, you know,
Right,
living cells into the trash.
right.
Um, if you're against abortion, then okay, sure,
Hmm.
keep trying to ban abortion, but don't say, well, we're going to like screw around with this downstream thing that is actually, helping people. Um, I don't know. I just feel like, I don't piss in the government's pool and I don't want them to like shit in my living room. Um, so basically, I don't know. That's like been, and now, back in the Bush administration, there was the same they were doing a similar like moratorium on stem cell research. And what ended up happening was the scientists who were doing it just got funding from private donors. It was a lot harder to get the cells and stuff. And then within the labs, they would have little labels on the equipment saying like you can use this microscope for stem cells, but you can't use this microscope for stem cells. It's like two microscopes, same microscope side by side.
Oh,
Um,
but this one
and
was tax dollars and this one was
exactly.
donated.
It's like, oh well, this is the like, you know, non-stem cell microscope, so it's pure and like this other microscope is like, is has moral
This
like
is the water fountain for white people and this is the one
yeah,
for colored
exactly.
people. And it's
It's just
like,
like
hey, everyone,
crazy.
maybe we're being ridiculous again. Or
Yeah.
still.
Yeah. It was just like and you can still find those tags places. I was what does this tag mean? And they're like, oh, like let me tell you how ridiculous things were in like the early 2000s. It was just like, geez, like did anyone in the administration go into the lab and actually like see, the effects? Because I'm sure on paper they're like, oh, well, we'll just say they can't buy, we don't want any fetal tissue being like used with equipment from tax money. And it's like, well, guess what? Then they just bought another microscope and did the exact same thing. It's like, I
Right.
don't know.
It's just like self-imposed roadblocks
Yeah,
that we have to find a way to navigate around.
yeah. I mean, it's. I don't think. I mean, I'm sure some of the research was stopped because people were just like, I'm not going to buy two microscopes. I'm not going to buy two centrifuges. I'll just work with mouse stem cells and try to wait this.
Yeah.
But a lot of work, a lot of really good work has been done, especially in HIV, where rather than having to do tests on human beings, we can actually take mice, insert them with human stem cells, and then we get like humanized mice where they have like a human immune system.
Hmm.
Um, and so like I think that's a lot better use of time and money because yeah, the alternative is like human testing essentially,
Right.
um, or just not doing any work on it at all and just saying like, hey, sorry, people with HIV and AIDS, like you have kind of a tough problem, so that sucks.
Taxpayers said, "Screw you.
Yeah, it's
You're
like
on your own."
it's like I heard they have less ethics in China, so like you might want to go there.
Yeah.
Um, but and they'll probably do testing on you. So,
Right.
um, but yeah, it's just some of the disconnects between like what I think is done purely for the optics of it, because I'm sure there are people like, oh, like I can't believe they were doing research on like baby parts. It's like thank God that the administration got rid of that. And it's like, okay, you're really thinking in like the shortest term possible here. Like you're not like you're not even thinking about those kids are going to were going to be aborted anyway. But doing the research on it is, if anything, is like
Right. The
a, a benefit to society.
If your issue is any two sex cells that have come together now need to become into an adult, it's like there's many other ways that you can benefit someone's life than by banning abortion
Yeah,
and banning the use of like stem cells.
yeah,
That's not how you help. Um, and the fact that some people think that's how they can help is by like protesting and picketing and like yelling at people. It's like, okay, you're being ridiculous.
yeah. Well, and I don't know. I mean, a lot of people are like, well, they could have just been put up for adoption. It's like, okay, how many kids have you adopted?
Right.
Like, it's like
And
you're saying this, but are you
guess what?
walking
The
along?
quality of life of a lot of adopted kids isn't great.
Yeah,
A lot of them have significant developmental issues based on not having all of their needs met in the right ways.
yeah,
So it's not about the quality of life. Everyone's assuming that they're going to have this beautiful life as long as they're born. And I'm not promoting people going and having sex and getting abortions as a means of birth control. That's not at all
yeah,
what I'm saying. I'm saying that you should work on bettering the lives of everyone around you, not just yelling at people because you think they're doing it
yeah. And I don't know. I don't think that anyone goes into that decision lightly. Um,
wrong. Right, right.
you
Especially
know,
when you're faced with like the amount of like social opposition that
yeah,
like people are literally berating you and attacking you. It's not like you're going, well, whatever. Might as well get an
yeah,
abortion.
yeah. It's like I've got some free time this weekend. Like, I guess I should probably take care of it.
Yeah,
Like,
get an abortion and a diet coke. It's
yeah,
like no, not the same type of decision.
yeah,
There's a lot that goes into that, and I feel like people, they're not putting themselves in the shoes.
yeah,
They think everything is what they know, and it's
yeah. And then it's
very
like,
ignorant.
there are all of these, like kids these days, like all these gangs and violence and stuff. And it's like, yeah, they probably aren't having that great of a life. Like, they probably, you know, their parents probably weren't, in the best situation to
Hmm.
have them at the time, and maybe they didn't have access to early childhood education, that kind of thing. And so, increasing the population even further when struggling to, raise the children that we have. I don't know. I think there's a disconnect there as
Yeah.
well. It's very short sighted, I think.
I'll share a personal example for me that like just highlighted how easy it is to have fear-based responses. Where a friend of mine, we had been talking about hunting, and he asked me, he's like, "Do you think that suppressors should be used on guns?" And my immediate response was no. I don't think everyone should have access to a suppressor. And then he goes, "Why not?" And I went, because I was gonna say that people could use them to kill other people, but they do that anyway without suppressors. That suppressors, I don't think, are gonna increase the amount of like murders that happen or murders that people get away with, because a lot of people get away with it actually, which is terrifying. And that's a whole nother issue of why they get away with it, because of resources, and people don't really care about inner city crime in the same way. As like that's not what funding is going toward. But
yeah,
like I realized it was like, oh, mine was just a fear-based response if I thought a bad thing would happen. When really it's apparently like beneficial to like our ears, as well as it doesn't disrupt the environment of the ecosystem in that area where you're hunting as much. It shows to have positive benefits, and there's places around the world where they're required to use suppressors when hunting.
hmm,
And I was just like, wow, I had this stance. I had a very strong emotional response when when he asked me if we should use suppressors. And then I was like, wow, that was all just fear based. Then
yeah,
I was uninformed on like what benefit it would have. I only jumped to a conclusion that actually isn't even true. Then I was like, oh wow. And that type of thing for me, I try and apply it to other areas of my life. Like with this circumstance here, it's like, oh well, don't let research happen on like the stem cells of like a fetus, and it's like, why not?
yeah,
It, and I want to make sure that I'm not on the other end of like the ends justify the means. But if
yeah,
you look at the alternative, it's where we're not expanding our ability to prevent harm, and we're not causing harm by doing this. And
yeah,
that's a big piece that I think is being thrown out the window. Is like what harm is being caused through this action?
yeah,
There's no additional harm in the equation based on research. This
yeah.
kind
It's
of
like,
research, I should say.
there's more. I mean, I would almost be more against like some of the model organisms that we're using, like doing research on chimps and stuff. I think that there's actually a
Yeah.
moratorium on there now, but one of the things that's growing is these lemurs. Trying to think of the name. Anyway, they're these like really small lemurs. They're really cute, but it turns out they're really good for studying like issues with human lungs, essentially, because mice, mouse lungs are really not uh, anywhere close to what human lungs are like.
Hmm.
And so there's kind of been a push to start using these lemurs. I mean, luckily, the guy who like decided on starting to study these lemurs has pretty much said, we're only going to study them in their natural habitat. But there's definitely something to be said about, there needs to be a cutoff on like suffering, as far as like stem cells are not going to suffer from genetic manipulation. I mean, they'll be stressed out, but that's like a chemical response.
Sure,
And
but
like,
you can stress out a rubber band too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. um, so yeah, I think there's something to be said. And, the stuff we have to do to mice for certain research, like I was doing a rotation for looking at myelination of neurons, which is like basically they find that myelin breaks down in people with like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So it's like an insulative material that wraps around neurons. But to do that research, I mean, we essentially took mice and we're injecting viruses into mouse pup eyes and then waiting for them to grow, drugging them up, and then essentially scalping them and decapitating them. And
Right,
so
because we're not
um,
allowed to use these other means.
Yeah. Well,
that
we don't have a good model for,
Sure, sure.
other stuff like that now where, we need neurons and stuff and eyes, but eventually I think we'll get into there's a field called like organoid research where you're able to make like, you know, small living like globs of cells that are able to recapitulate either like, the digestive tract or
Hmm.
something.
Hmm.
Um where you don't need a like live organism to do testing on it, something that is able to feel pain and whatnot. That's not to be said that like the mice and other research organisms are actually treated exceptionally well. They're
Something I
treated.
think a lot of people look right past is these test animals are treated better than a lot of the animals in the food industry,
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
and that should be a more of a concern. It's like
yeah, I
let's
mean,
find a better means for food before you start ripping things out of the hands of scientists.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. They're they have a certain amount of space that they need. They have like space to run around in, like mandatory. They
And
have
there's
to have a little
people that
wheel.
care about them all
Yeah.
of the time.
Well, they're expensive too. I mean, it's like people who are using mice as test subjects, they're in every day, weighing them, feeding them, uh, making sure like that they're not stressed. I mean, there are certain requirements for like how long they need to be allowed with their mother before they're,
They're treated
weaned
better
off.
than pets.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, puppy farms are worse than the way that these mice are treated. Um, because and like they have to be kept super healthy because you don't want to like put new variables in like, if you're doing all your testing on sick mice, not I mean,
No,
some of them will be sick,
right.
but like they're not gonna have the flu or something.
Yeah, you're not going to get accurate results if you're not taking care of them and controlling the environment in
Yeah,
a way that is conducive to their development.
exactly. And like, the control mice, they'll basically just live normal lives all the way to, I mean, some of them will then like breed and then,
Hmm.
become the next generation of test mice, but then other ones, they grow up to adulthood and then, the tests are done and then they're, you know, drugged and then CO2 is added to a chamber and then they just kind of fall asleep and that's it. Um, versus, stray cats, being born, dropped off on the street, running around till they're 5, infested with worms, and then get hit by a car or something and
Right.
slowly die. So, um,
Or in someone's backyard, like chained up
yeah,
to a tree or a post.
exactly. Yeah. Or yeah, getting abused by like some owner or something.
Yeah. Some little kid finds it and pulls its limbs off because he doesn't have healthy parenting.
Yeah,
Because his mom couldn't get an abortion, but she had no means of raising him because she was
yeah,
all methed out.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
it's like
it's all connected.
when you look deeper into these types of things, and I think that's what people are not doing. They're failing to look deeper into what is the alternative.
Yeah,
That they're jumping to assumptions with their confirmation bias, and not looking at like, do I think that some of the testing done to lead us into the field of science and psychology as it is today was ethical? No, not at all. And
yeah,
that's why there was changes in the ethical standards and ethical codes that you were required to abide by.
yeah,
Like otherwise your study is invalid and illegal. Like
exactly.
there are standards to that is like way higher level of enforcement than on someone's day-to-day life of what they're doing. Like the average person is probably doing more unethical things than a scientist.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and you look back like there are pictures from like the 50s where scientists are smoking cigarettes and like pipetting things by mouth, like pipetting toxins by mouth. Like, there was a story of like, um, a scientist accidentally got some virus like on his the end of his pipe or something, and he took a lit cigar and like put it out and then just kept smoking or something, and like it's just like, yeah, back in the day, it was the Wild West. But I think after a bunch of accidents have happened, slowly they've gotten their shit together, essentially.
Yeah.
Um,
But the masses, the general population, has not.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, there's definitely. Well, we can do like scientists can do more harm if they aren't being ethical because
Oh,
like we just
definitely.
have access to I have access to tons of toxins and chemicals and like things that would explode um that I need to
Sure, but
read.
if you were educated enough, you could find a means of getting that or creating that stuff
That's a
yourself.
good point. Yeah.
That like
It would be
these,
tough.
it's educated people using these things. That it's like you don't want to give a power drill to a toddler.
Yeah.
They're going to hurt themselves or someone else with it. But you can
Yeah.
definitely give a power tool to someone who's been working in the construction industry for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Like, it's
And I mean
fine to
that's
have a
what's
cop carrying a gun around. It's
yeah.
fine to have a scientist have a cupboard full of toxins.
Yeah. And I mean that's where it comes back to the whole like how cheap CRISPR is becoming as well because, there are no
It's becoming publicly accessible.
yeah, I mean you can order a CRISPR kit online right now for
Hmm.
like $40.
I have zero
And
interest in that right now.
yeah, no, it's fine. I mean,
That
I
would
think
take
you
so
can
much work for me to do anything effective with
I mean, you
it.
can you can modify bacteria or something with it, which,
Woohoo.
yeah, it's like
it's
you
it's
did it, like
amazing. I don't want to belittle the
no.
significance of that, especially the cost of that is incredible that we can have something so um, with such access and ease of distribution.
Yeah.
But the average person would have no idea how to do anything with it or to even know that they did something with it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
which
I mean,
I mean, hey,
you
people, go ahead, do it. Like, educate yourselves.
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I'm all about
Um
people being more educated.
yeah, you definitely need some training and stuff to um do anything other than like, you know, modify some bacteria so oh now it glows green and okay, well
You
that's
would
neat.
still need some training to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could probably you would just need an incubator and yeah, you'd need a little bit of training. You could probably figure it out in like a week or something. But yeah,
Right, I
but
probably could, but I'd say the average person probably couldn't.
well, I think people
I think they would
said the
get too
same thing.
distracted, too defeated by not understanding these different terms and concepts and not wanting to look into them that they would give up.
Yeah.
That's probably why
I
most
mean,
people don't have these already.
yeah, exactly. Or they're just like, what am I really going to do with this?
Yeah.
Um but I think it's the same thing with like computer science and how we've seen like the growth of hacking and,
Hmm.
it used to be, government agencies were the only ones who were hacking people and now it's, some dude like sitting in his room is like, you know what, I'm gonna hack like Neopets today and drain their like store or something. And I think eventually it's going to be the same way with this kind of technology where you know the the price will be down so low there aren't going to be restraints in place and the expertise and the knowledge to do stuff with it is going to be pretty easily accessible that eventually people are going to put two and two together and say like you know I don't know what the equivalent of hacking Neopets would be with CRISPR, but maybe like you know
Changes the
I'll
hair color of everyone on their street.
yeah something like that. It's like or like yeah everyone's gonna start growing beards like nearby or something. I don't know, but yeah I think uh, there needs to be more discussion about it
But then
because we are
another way to look at it too is I remember when I was in high school, one of my friends he was into like computer hacking and like programming and understood computers on a way deeper level than I even can pretend to understand them now. But he gave me a walkthrough of if you go to a YouTube website or video, and then you go into this tab and go down into these settings and into these options, and then you pull out this code from this line here, and then you paste it into this program and you do this to it, it'll install that video onto your computer, and then you use
Yeah.
this to convert that, and now you have that as an audio file. And it was like a bunch of these steps, and you had to follow the code and do these things that I would have never figured out on my own.
Yeah.
But he was able to, because of his understanding, teach me that. And
Yeah.
then I used that to get audio for videos. And sure, it was probably super illegal at the time, or maybe not because no one was doing it.
Yeah.
That it was, I used it for, okay, cool. Now I have this audio from this video that I made. This is super
Yeah.
sweet that I was able to separate this out through these means. And now you could go to YouTube to FLV or YouTube to MP3.com or FLV to MP3.com, type in a YouTube link, and then bloop, now your
It'll
computer
do it
gets
for
that
you. Yeah.
MP3 file. And that website is just running the exact steps that he had explained to me.
Yeah.
That I used to have to backdoor all of this stuff, go through all the steps, but now you just go to a web page because someone else did all of that work, wrote it into a program, and now the average person can go and do that without doing any of the work. It's just
Exactly.
copy
Yeah.
and paste a link. So that's the same type of evolution that I see in something like CRISPR, for instance, is right now you have to be someone who understands and knows how to use it and is doing all these things. But down the road, it might be a thing where everyone just has like an app on their phone that applies CRISPR in some way, and you can use it for like personal modifications or something.
Yeah.
Because the
So,
scientists do all of the work and then plug it into something, and now there's a practical application that you don't have to do all the work for because someone else did that work and gave you a tool that does that
yeah.
work.
Yeah. I've seen the same thing with like sequencing analysis. So back in the day, you had to be both a biologist and this like comp sci genius in order to analyze sequencing results. Now we have like these things called pipelines where it's just like, okay, you know put in your DNA like data here. Okay, now type this in, type that in, type that in, and basically some genius comp sci person figured this stuff out, and now I can barely code, but I just kind of rely on this other person who wrote
Yeah.
out these steps. The only issue is when you start having to troubleshoot, you're just like, oh, well, like, don't really know, like, why, nothing's coming out of this black box. But um, it's like, that's where you have to go back and find some comp sci person to being like, yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I need you to tell me what I'm doing wrong. So yeah, I can see where the same thing would eventually happen where I don't know necessarily what would people want to use it for on a day-to-day basis, um other than just for doing.
Here's another analogy though. If you were to hand the average person, like, go pick anyone off of the street somewhere and hand them all the components to a motherboard for a smartphone. So here
Yeah.
you go. What are they going to use that for? Nothing, because they have
Yeah.
no idea what to do with it. They have no idea how to like plug it together, let alone the capability to solder the pieces or to then install the programming and the sequencing necessary to, and then the next level you get to the software that you have to install on it.
Yeah.
No one, I think 99.99% of the world population, I'm included in that, would be able to do anything applicable with the components of a smartphone.
Yeah.
That it's just because I have no practical application for it now doesn't mean that someone else couldn't do something cool and then hand it to me and now I have a practical application for it.
Yeah.
But when an issue shows up, I go, I don't know why it's not working. We'll turn it off and turn it back on again. Like,
Yeah.
no, I need to go to someone who knows how to use this and have them fix it, type of
Yeah.
thing. And I can do more work on my smartphone than the average person, just like you could probably do more with CRISPR than the average person, but that doesn't mean that you have all of the answers.
Yeah.
You're going to figure way more out than I am on that front. most likely. I don't know the future.
Yeah.
um, but that's the type of thing where like you need to accept that I'm not going to use this for anything. I'm not going to be messing around with CRISPR most likely in my life
Yeah.
unless something shows up where it has a practical application in my life.
Yeah.
Because someone like you and your teams were working on it and figured that out and did that work. Um,
Yeah.
if I were to
I
start
think,
that work now, I would have a long road to just catch up.
yeah. I think it gets back to, I think it's interesting that, people are willing to go to experts for stuff like troubleshooting, but then, like, it's like, okay, we'll accept the science on this because, oh, well, I don't know how to figure this out, so I'll trust their expertise. But then stuff like, getting back into like the vaccination stuff or, then it's like, well, like, I don't trust experts on this, but I trust experts on that. It's like, where I don't understand like the disconnect there. I mean, I guess it goes back to confirmational bias, but
Yeah. Does it
um,
align with what I want or not?
yeah, it's like, well, if I have no opinion on this, I'll trust experts. But once I form an opinion, then like I'm smarter than experts.
Yeah.
Um,
Unless they agree with me.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And then they're a
yeah,
part of my defense.
yeah, and then I'll use it against other people who disagree with me.
Yeah.
Um, and say like, oh, look, these experts said this. And
Um,
like with the vaccinations, it's like one paper by one guy that's been disproven. That's the only paper that they cite over and over again.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, the dog just opened the door somehow. Um, but that's also something talking like why these people are jumping on these bandwagons and things. I've been contemplating a lot in my own life, and whenever someone has like a judgment of what you're doing or an opposition or is like no like anti-vax is the way, I've I've just been trying to figure that out personally, and it appears to be a fear response,
Yeah.
and half of the time that fear response can be due to a lack of understanding, or back to what we were saying earlier, the confirmation bias piece of it doesn't align with what they believe. They have evidence showing them that what I believe is wrong, so now I'm going to say you're wrong, you can't do that,
Yeah.
because that's easier than me going, wow, I need to reevaluate my life.
Yeah. I think also, especially in science, just the difference between correlation and causation is a really big issue that a lot of people outside the community just
Hey.
don't pick up on. And I think that gets into the anti-vax thing too, where it's like, oh well, my kid was vaccinated, and then later on they became autistic. It's like, okay, yeah, there's definitely
Right. There's a
yeah,
correlation there.
probably, yeah,
Two
I
of
would
those
say,
things both happened.
yeah, like I'm sure 100% of people with autism were vaccinated. That doesn't mean that
Right,
everyone who's
but just so
vaccinated
you
is
know,
autistic.
I grew up in New Jersey and I have gray hair. So
Yeah,
anyone who grows up in New Jersey is going to get gray hair. So they need to ban
exactly.
growing up in New Jersey
Yeah,
unless you want gray hair.
yeah.
And my
It's
brothers
like,
both have gray hair too, and they grew up in New Jersey. So now I have other people who can
yeah,
support my
it's an
claim. It's
N
like,
of three
nope.
now. Yeah, yeah,
Nope, that's an
yeah,
ignorant claim. There's too many
yeah,
variables, and correlation is so often misrepresented as causation.
yeah, yeah. I mean, causation is just so difficult to prove. Um, really in anything, I think. But
Because there's too many variables. How,
yeah,
how do you isolate one single thing?
yeah,
Because you're going to break that down, and then that's made up of parts.
yeah. And then even by breaking stuff down, that's you're also then adding a variable. That's like what the issue in biology is. It's just like you can break it down to this protein binds to this protein, but you're not taking into account that these proteins could be on different sides of the cell and never even see each other. So just
Yeah,
the fact that you're showing that they interact doesn't mean that like that interaction is important or is like physiologically relevant. um and So I think, yeah, as being in the biology field, like I'm keenly aware of, just the fact that uh, you can pretty much make anything correlate to what something else.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
by
That's a great
proving
point.
that correlation doesn't really mean anything.
It
Um,
almost never implies causation.
yeah,
You can find significant correlation where these two things will happen in conjunction with each other most of the time.
yeah,
But again, that does not imply that one of them causes the other one,
yeah.
or that this factor causes both of those. Like, that's not necessarily true.
These things are
Um,
never that simple, honestly. Like it's
right.
just never A makes B.
You
Um,
can look at biology and then break all of it down into chemistry, and then
yeah,
break all of that down into physics, and then break all of that down into quantum physics. And now we're at areas that like people are just like trying to come up with stuff with math.
yeah,
Like, so we're just trying to use math to understand what's really going on. And there's a discussion I had just recently. One of my friends told me that they've discovered subatomic particles. There's
oh,
things smaller than quarks that they're starting to like figure out mathematically. And it's like, okay, how small are we going to get before we find it? I don't know that we ever will. And
yeah,
we're so far removed from like my physical body right now and the interactions of like my genes and genetic makeup when I'm looking at the subatomic scale that it's like you're not going to find that causality.
yeah,
Not clear cut
no,
anyway. It's going to
yeah. It's just
have too many things tied to it.
yeah, just complexity on complexity,
Yeah.
exponentially. You're never going to find such a clear cut answer that people. I think we're hardwired to try to find
I think that's because
simple
it's
solutions.
convenient.
Yeah,
I don't have to understand all of it if it's clear cut.
yeah,
Guess what? It's not
or
clear
it's
cut though.
yeah, it's easier to wrap your mind around something
Yeah,
simple. So
especially if you don't want to have to do research and expand your current understanding of things. If you want it to conform what you currently understand, then you're gonna assume it's clear cut. That's convenient.
yeah,
It is not true though.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a lot of work to you know push yourself to try to not just accept the simple
Yeah,
solution to something.
and this again, I'll bring this back and tie in mindfulness of like if you're stressed in your day-to-day life, you're not looking to spend energy on challenging your current belief system.
Yeah,
You just want things to be easier right now, and you're
yeah,
going to
exactly.
attach to anything that aligns with making things easier for you right now.
Yeah, yeah. We like to be comfortable. I think, and
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, it's it's a comfortable place to be where you feel like you understand everything and the world, your world conforms to your beliefs. Um, and yeah, it takes courage, I think, to say, you know what, like I don't understand this, and I don't think like my understanding of the world isn't necessarily right, and I mean I have a hard time doing that.
Yeah,
I think everyone does.
I
Uh,
agree.
so
I think I find myself facing this like existential struggle on a fairly consistent basis because I question that. And I think it happens every time I question my understanding. Like, is my understanding and concept of reality true? And
yeah,
every time you question that, you're faced with an existential crisis.
yeah,
Most people, again, going back to like, if you're stressed, you don't have the time for that. You're going to have a mental breakdown. You're going to
yeah.
freak out if you have an existential crisis amidst like a
Daily
physical
stress.
world
Yeah,
crisis and daily
yeah,
stressors, right? You're not going to be very efficient at your job if you're contemplating what you understand to be true about your reality and existence.
yeah,
Unless you learn how to navigate in that headspace, which is something I've been having a lot of fun playing with.
yeah,
But I don't think that's the norm. I've
yeah,
had people tell me so many times, it's like, no, that's too deep. I'm like, okay, so you're struggling with so much stuff that you can't contemplate what's underneath your current motivators and structures for your
Yeah.
existence. And that's going to lead to a lot of ill-informed decisions and perspectives and biases, and then people are acting on those and trying to impose those onto other people's lives who might be functioning on a deeper level, like
Yeah.
researchers at Stanford, being told by like the masses on social media forums, you can't do this or that. It's like, go get your life together before you tell someone else how to live theirs.
Yeah. No, exactly. I think, yeah, like you said, people don't feel like they have the time to sit down and just, you know, think about things at a deeper level and then inform themselves based on that thought process.
And accept that you're probably wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
That's all I've ever discovered, is that I was wrong before.
yeah.
And each
No,
time
I
I find
mean,
a new truth, I find out that part of that was wrong.
and like, especially these days, I'm almost constantly the stupidest person in the room. Just like, I,
That's awesome to have surrounded yourself with people smarter than you all the time, though.
yeah, but you know, you walk in, it's like,
It's
oh, like,
humbling.
yeah, like, like, I'm really honestly not that smart of a guy compared to like these other 50 people who
It
like,
depends how you're
are,
measuring it too.
yeah, but I think a lot of people don't get to have that um or be in that situation where, you know,
That's because they're surrounded
they're
by idiots.
yeah, like they're not being pushed.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's probably the biggest lesson I've learned this year was just like, you thought you were a pretty smart guy, but like there are a whole lot of people who are thinking at stuff at a much deeper level and like a much more complex level than you could even imagine
I
at
will
this
want to
point.
offer to you though to keep in mind that there's no restriction on your ability to go deeper.
Yeah.
Um, and there may be some type of restriction, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is like, don't sell yourself short just because you don't know everything someone else knows.
Yeah. No,
Um,
I'm there to learn. So, you
right.
know.
And so are they. That's why they have this deeper level understanding, is because they've continued to learn.
Yeah.
So as long as you remain open and don't shut yourself down,
Yeah. No,
I'm gonna definitely enjoy picking your brain about these types of things as you
yeah.
learn more.
Yeah, talk to me in a year and I'll be like, "Oh, I'm the smartest guy there now." Like,
Probably
but
not.
yeah.
I think you'll know that that's
Yeah.
never going to be true.
Yeah.
In a conversation I had with someone yesterday, we were talking about how there's like a 1 in 7 billion chance that you're the best at anything.
Yeah.
That's slim.
Yeah, and I mean,
You have a better chance of just randomly picking a genetic marker on the DNA strain, right? Because there's only 3 billion.
exactly. And like maybe the thing you're good at is like, you're the best at, I don't know, like picking marbles up, like something,
Right.
some
You can pick
random
6 marbles
skill.
up faster than anyone else in the
Yeah.
world.
It's like being the best at something
Congratulations.
that's important is probably, I mean, the odds of that are even, um,
Yeah,
it
and
probably
then
could,
you could have subjectively important versus like globally important.
yeah.
It's important to some people that they can stack cups really quick.
Yeah. Or like the
And guess
best,
what? Only 1 in 7 billion is the best at it.
or like the best, Fortnite player or
Right.
something, or,
And guess what? It's not one person who always stands on the top.
yeah.
There's always someone striving right below them to overcome, and it
Yeah.
oscillates.
Yeah. I think, but, that's not going to matter to a farmer in Thailand who doesn't
Right.
have electricity. Yeah.
Right. He does not give any craps about Fortnite. Never even
But,
considered it.
the guy who developed, fertilizer or like mass production of fertilizer, then yeah, that's probably, that's going to impact the farmer in Thailand and that's going to impact,
Hmm.
everyone because it's impacting the food we eat. So,
Yeah,
um,
there's a practical application to that
yeah.
um, discovery, I'll call it.
Yeah. So, and just like, yeah, the odds of you being exceptional at something that's also impactful, I think. you know, it's almost impossible. I mean, it's obviously not impossible, but so yeah, I think just keeping everything in perspective. Uh,
But there are the cases of like you look at historical figures of like, let's say Isaac Newton.
yeah,
He had a whole bunch of discoveries that had far-reaching application
yeah,
and foundation. That is like one person can do a ton of great things, and then a ton of people can do zero great things.
yeah.
It's
I
it's
honestly
funny
think
how that
that
balances out.
that age of science though is probably gone at this point, where one person. I mean, maybe not in something like theoretical
That's a
physics.
great point. And I'd like to hear your perspective on it. Mine is that we've gotten so we've had to become so specific into
Yeah,
the individual branches of it that you can't, like you were saying before, like you need to go to someone who knows like deep levels of computer science if you're having an issue with this one thing that you're using for deeper levels of understanding of biology than they have.
yeah,
That it's like we're becoming specified into very particular branches of
yeah.
fields of discovery.
Well, I just think now the money and the time it takes to make small increments of progress, especially in biology, means that one person just there's not enough man hours, and you're just you're better off hiring more people for your research group or collaborating than back in the 50s and 60s there were people who figured out cell division just by sitting around and removing or putting two fly cells together and then looking at them under a microscope and doing that 1,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
And so an undergrad could do that now, or you could pay someone to do that, and it would take maybe a month with like the technology we have, whereas it took them like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Um, but now, like, you're not going to publish a paper on you know that kind of thing because
Right. No, and you
that's
you
not
brought up a
big.
really great point that I don't know that I had considered to have as much of an impact as it probably does. But the depth that we're exploring now, the level of understanding that we're striving to reach, is too deep for a single person to get to. Typically,
Yeah,
it's going to take a team,
yeah, yeah. There's
and
just
it's one person who's not going to reach that depth in a whole bunch of areas either.
yeah, yeah. That's why lots of labs have you've got your expert postdoc in developmental biology, and this guy's good with computers, and this guy's good with chromatin biology, and they're all working on the same project because they have expertise in different levels, but no one's an expert in all three of them. They might all
Right.
have some knowledge in each one, but when it comes to troubleshooting, the computer expert is not going to know why the samples that they got were so shitty.
Mm-hmm.
And the the chromatin biologist isn't going to understand why the animals aren't developing properly. And so you need people from different fields with different expertise in order to push anything forward because everything just overlaps. So like you can't tear away cell biology from developmental organism. They're all overlapping fields with genetics and even biophysics now.
And
Um,
to just bring back in a more layperson example for the same concept is going back to the smartphone. You have someone who knows how to make the microchip that goes in there, and then someone else who understands these different parts of like an LED screen.
yeah,
That they're like the liquid crystal displays. That's pretty impressive stuff that they're doing
yeah,
anymore. Um, and then you have someone who's doing the software, and those three different people aren't going to understand the other person's job,
yeah,
not well enough to be able to do it the way they do it.
yeah,
And that applies to, I think, most areas of our life anymore because we're getting so complex.
yeah,
um, that in the science field, again, like if you look at the amount of funding that goes into science, it's fairly insignificant compared to
Yeah.
the distribution of like our economic resources. Yet it has such a vast impact on our day-to-day life
Yeah.
that I don't know. Again, I'm confused by people's priorities.
Yeah. Um, you know, I think it comes down to fear at a certain point as
Yeah.
far as like I think the defense budget and that kind of thing where it's like, you know, if we are we really $1 million safer when the um the defense budget versus, like I'm not going to say there's not waste in science. I mean, there's going
Oh,
to be
sure,
waste because
sure.
things don't work out.
Anywhere.
Yeah. Um, but at least, better that it fails and we tried something than, not knowing. And so in that sense, there's
That's a
never that much.
scientist mind, though.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like, what do you mean? Like, we haven't cured cancer yet? Like,
A political cartoon I was introduced to when I had started in engineering degree is actually what I started to go into for undergrad.
yeah,
And this political cartoon has constantly reminded me that I do have the scientist brain and perspective on things. Of it said the cartoon was the difference between a normal person and an engineer. And the first picture was there's this button and the normal person pushes it and it zaps them and they go, "Ow! Dang, I'm never doing that again."
yeah,
And then the next picture, the person has got like the engineer over it and they push the button and they go, "Ow, dang. I wonder if it does that every time." And then they push it again.
yeah,
And that's like they did not like that shock, but it's like that innate curiosity
yeah,
of like, well, I'm gonna see, like I want to find out.
yeah,
Where the other party is avoiding pain. I'm gonna do as little as possible so long as I don't experience more pain.
yeah,
Where the other side of it is, no, I'm gonna explore it and I might experience pain, but I'm gonna know more. I'm gonna learn something.
yeah,
That it's there's an analogy that's been brought up a handful of times for me is the difference between a buffalo and a cow. If there is a storm, cows all group together and start to move away from the storm. Buffalo all group together and turn and walk into the storm. And there's this like the initial response is like, that's dumb. Why would you walk into a storm when they end up, sure, it's hitting them in the face, but then they get through it in like a fraction of the time, where a cow that's walking away from the storm is following over them.
yeah,
And now they're going through it for longer. And it ends up costing them more resources. But in their mind is like, well, at least I'm getting away
not in
from
the storm.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah, at
yeah,
least it's not getting worse the way I'm going.
yeah,
Um, when it's actually a less effective, less efficient means, but you have to be willing to face the storm.
yeah.
Which,
No, that's a great analogy. Yeah,
yeah, and that's been brought up in a handful of different areas for me recently that I've been coming across. And I'm like, this, I think this holds a lot of truth, and highlights a lot of the things that I'm seeing when observing populations. No offense, general population, but you're like a bunch of cows.
yeah,
You're running away from anything that could be scary, anything
yeah,
that could be painful,
yeah.
instead
I
of
think,
facing it head on and exploring it and learning from it,
yeah,
coming
I
through on
think
the other side.
that's why. I mean, this gets back to the whole like regulations. I think, I mean, we can keep kicking the can down the line and saying like, oh well, we'll just say like, don't do this, and we won't really put any rules to enforce it. But at least we did something. Versus like, okay, you know, let's say exactly, what you can and can't do, and get governments to start enforcing it rather than, in China it's the Wild West. In the US, you can't do this at all. Um, you know, People are just going to start moving to China because
Right.
it's easier. Um,
The
and
war on drugs did not decrease drug usage whatsoever.
yeah,
that's the same type of thing of like with the war on science, you're just going to have people doing it in shady, sketchy ways.
Exactly.
And then you're going to have like some mutant army coming out of China, and everyone's like, why can't we defend against this? It's like, because you stopped funding it 8 years ago.
Yeah. It's like they're, using CRISPR weapons, and it's like why is it taking scientists so long to, stop this? It's like, well, we
Right.
cut funding, so um and like, sorry, we can't shoot viruses out of the air. And you know, all of our jets aren't really helping.
That's a super funny thing. I
Yeah,
like that.
thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, I should probably get going, but this has been a great talk.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I like closing with just like a reflection.
Yeah.
Any major takeaways from the conversation?
Um, I think, well, it was great catching up with you, first off.
Likewise. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Yeah. Reflections. I don't know. I think we hit a lot about, just societal and human tendencies as far
Mm-hmm.
as, you know, what what are some things that are inherently human that we can be better at by recognizing and pushing back against, I think.
Yeah.
Um, I
Um,
think that's just reflecting on what some of the stuff that we've talked about. Um, I don't know if that's totally what you're getting at with the
no,
reflection.
totally, totally. And
I,
that actually is very similar to the reflection I would have of our discussion, which relates to something I was reading the other day along the lines of a lot of people are functioning with the lower levels of the brain, the where the prefrontal cortex isn't the area that we're really working on a ton of development in,
yeah,
because it's more of that stress response, that reaction. I have everything I need, and now I'm going to function through that instead of looking to expand and gain greater control over your actions and your conscious mind and having that intention, that I feel like is a constant like battle of give and take between the people who are expanding in that area and that front versus the people who are not utilizing
yeah,
those tendencies and are now in opposition to anyone expanding
yeah,
because it's getting further from what they're comfortable with.
exactly. And they don't
And
want to have to change their behavior. So,
yeah, that overall people just need to be a little more well informed before they're
yep,
so confident.
yeah,
And
definitely.
as you become more well informed, I think you become more confident in certain things, but recognize that you're not confident in the answers.
Exactly. Or
So
as you know more about certain things, you recognize how little you.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. The more you know, the more you know you don't know.
exactly. Yeah.
Yep. And I again just want to thank you so much for sharing some of this information with me because it's stuff that I haven't researched. I don't have as well of an understanding as it is you do, and you helped answer a lot of questions I had about DNA and genetic markers and makeups and the way that like yeah how do we have DNA in all of our cells, but we have the different stuff. You answered some of that stuff for me,
Yeah.
which is awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, this has been, like, honestly a pleasure. I mean, I love talking about this stuff. So,
I love I love these types of discussions, and this is something that I don't have as much to bring to the table on this topic. So super appreciative I got to pick your brain about it a little and hear what you have to say.
yeah, this has been great. We'll definitely, once I actually get into what I'm researching, like, I'd love to talk some more, and we can, you know, do some more bio or talk about anything else. So,
Awesome.
um,
I'm super excited for that.